Some of the deadliest hiking disasters begin with people who mistake confidence for experience. Join me as I uncover inexperienced hikers who died in very dumb ways. From a woman who believed one Netflix movie had taught her everything she needed to conquer El Capitan, to hikers who ignored basic safety advice because they thought the mountains weren't as dangerous as everyone claimed. These are the moments when inexperience proved far deadlier than the trail itself.
June 12, 2021, a Saturday morning in Yosemite Valley, California, where clear skies, cool early temperatures, and calm winds created conditions that appeared nearly ideal for a summer day beneath the granite walls of El Capitan. Amarian Varelis was 34 years old and worked as a marketing coordinator for a wellness company in Sacramento, California. She lived alone, had a steady office job, and spent most of her free time focused on fitness.
That's just a normal person's life. A good one, honestly.
During the week, her routine was pretty consistent. Work, the gym, then sharing her progress on social media. On weekends, she'd usually head out to hike the maintained trails around Northern California. The people who knew her described her as disciplined, ambitious, and always looking for ways to challenge herself. That was a big part of her identity. Her posts often talked about pushing past your limits and believing that personal growth came from doing things that felt difficult. By every measure, she was a healthy and experienced recreational hiker. But there was one important thing she wasn't. Amarian wasn't a technical climber. There was no record of her doing indoor climbing, outdoor rock climbing, bouldering, or any kind of rope descent. Aside from the occasional Class 3 hike, she had no documented experience on steep granite, using climbing gear, or navigating terrain where one mistake could quickly become impossible to recover from.
Not even a bouldering gym. Nothing.
Yet in just a matter of weeks, one Netflix movie completely changed the way she saw climbing. But in the weeks leading up to June 12th, something started to change. Amarian had been watching a newly released Netflix movie about a fictional big wall climber, and she didn't just watch it once. She watched it over and over for several days, and the more she watched it, the more convinced she became that climbing wasn't nearly as difficult as people claimed. She wasn't just entertained by it, she began treating it like proof. Every time the fictional climber overcame another obstacle through determination alone, it reinforced what she already wanted to believe, that people made climbing sound far more difficult than it really was. Instead of seeing a scripted story built around dramatic moments, she saw confirmation that confidence could overcome obstacles people insisted required years of training. The more she watched, the less climbing looked like a technical discipline, and the more it looked like a test of mindset. Before long, she started posting about it online. She argued that the climbing community made the sport sound harder than it really was, mostly to keep other people out. Experienced climbers, in her view, had built an image of climbing as something only a select few could do. The more people warned about danger, the more convinced she became that those warnings were protecting an exclusive community rather than protecting inexperienced people. To her, all the ropes, gear, years of training, and climbing classes felt like gatekeeping more than actual safety measures.
I can see how that framing starts to simplify something that's actually built on layers of hard-earned experience.
She genuinely believed the biggest difference between experienced climbers and everyone else wasn't years of training. It was simply having the confidence to try. And she wasn't about to let a bunch of experts tell her otherwise. That belief developed during a period of personal frustration. Amarian had recently received a difficult professional performance review, which she believed reflected institutional bias rather than her actual abilities. Clearly a personal attack from someone who just didn't understand her unique talents. The fictional story's central theme that determination alone could overcome an establishment that underestimated capable people became personally meaningful to her.
I'm not mocking that connection, but it was a fictional character on fictional rock.
She told several acquaintances that she intended to travel to Yosemite that weekend to accomplish something significant, though she did not explain that she intended to climb El Capitan without ropes or climbing experience because, frankly, it was nobody's business but her own. 6 days before the trip, she purchased a pair of La Sportiva climbing shoes through an online retailer after comparing her street shoe size with an online fitting guide. No other climbing equipment was purchased or documented.
One pair of shoes. That was enough because, in her mind, the shoes represented the only piece she believed she'd be missing.
Everything else, years of practice, instruction, and technical systems she'd already convinced herself, were obstacles invented by other climbers rather than necessities. The environmental conditions on the morning of June 12th offered little indication of danger to a visitor unfamiliar with technical climbing. At 7 o'clock, the temperature on the valley floor measured 61 degrees Fahrenheit beneath a cloudless sky, with a light southwest wind of approximately 4 miles per hour. Forecasts called for afternoon highs, near 84 degrees, with low humidity and no precipitation. From the meadows below, El Capitan appeared sharply illuminated in the morning sun, while its lower granite slabs rose gradually enough to resemble steep hiking terrain rather than the beginning of one of the most technically demanding climbing objectives in North America.
I've stood in that meadow. It genuinely looks manageable from down there.
But that first impression can be really misleading. Getting onto the wall actually isn't that difficult. The loose rocks at the base are easy enough to cross, and the lower granite slabs can even be walked on in regular shoes. At first, it can feel like the climb is completely manageable. The problem is that it doesn't stay that way for long. Within about the first 100 feet, the angle changes dramatically.
I'm looking at that transition point, and it's almost abrupt how the terrain just stops behaving like the start.
What started as something you could walk across quickly turns into steep, exposed rock, where every move takes real climbing skills that usually come from years of experience. Yosemite rescue teams know this all too well. Just because someone makes it through the first part of the wall doesn't mean they're prepared for what comes next. The favorable weather at sunrise could also be misleading. Experienced climbing parties often begin early to take advantage of the cooler morning hours, knowing that the south-facing granite will spend the day absorbing direct sunlight. By early afternoon, the rock surface can become far hotter than the surrounding air, while the wall offers almost no shade, no accessible water, and few places to rest. Heat, dehydration, and fatigue steadily compound every decision to continue upward. The climbing itself changes just as quickly as the environment. Broad friction slabs give way to smaller edges and isolated footholds where progress depends on precise foot placement, balance, and body positioning rather than strength alone. Specialized climbing shoes help only when paired with the experience to interpret how the rubber grips the rock. Amarian's shoes had been purchased only days earlier and had never been used on granite, leaving her without the familiarity or technical skill that experienced climbers rely upon to move safely. The part of the wall Amarian was heading toward has caught people off guard before. From the ground, it actually looks like the climb gets easier for a while before becoming steep again farther up. For someone without climbing experience, that can be enough to keep moving higher, thinking the hard part is over.
I can see how that visual illusion would be enough to push someone just a little further without questioning it.
But that's the trap. By the time the wall makes it obvious you're in over your head, getting back down is often harder than going up. And without ropes, anchors, or someone climbing with you, every extra foot off the ground leaves you with fewer and fewer safe options. Amarian arrived at the El Capitan Meadow pullout early that morning after driving from a budget motel in El Portal, about 8 miles west of Yosemite Valley, where she'd spent the night. She was wearing athletic clothes and carrying a small hydration pack with about 32 ounces of water, a protein bar, and a brand new pair of La Sportiva climbing shoes she'd bought just a few days earlier. Sitting on a boulder near the parking area, she took off her trail runners and put on the climbing shoes. Before leaving the meadow, she stopped to take a few photos with El Capitan behind her, its southeast face already lit up by the morning sun. Those pictures, later recovered from her phone, would help investigators pinpoint where she was just before she walked toward the wall.
She looked excited in those photos. You can see it.
She then followed the informal use trail leading from the meadow toward the talus field beneath the southeast face. The route winds through open forest before climbing over large, uneven boulders that require careful footing and occasional use of the hands for balance. Along the way, she passed 2 photographers positioned near the trail to photograph climbers on El Capitan. Neither recalled anything unusual about her appearance or behavior.
I think about those 2 guys a lot. They had no way of knowing.
A person in athletic clothing carrying a small day pack toward the wall on a summer morning was not by itself remarkable. After roughly 40 minutes of hiking and scrambling across the talus, Amarian reached the base of the granite wall, where the gradual lower slabs marked the beginning of the terrain she intended to climb. At the base of El Capitan, a team of 3 experienced climbers from the San Francisco Bay Area was already preparing for a multi-day ascent of the nose route. As they organized ropes and climbing hardware, one member noticed Amarian studying the wall. What immediately stood out was what she was not carrying. She wore no harness or helmet, carried no rope or climbing rack, and her climbing shoes appeared brand new. Her small hydration pack looked more appropriate for a day hike than a technical climb. One of the climbers grew concerned and walked over to ask if she was meeting a partner or a guide.
That climber had every reason to just get on with his own day.
Amarian just scoffed and said she was climbing alone, like it was the most normal thing in the world. The climber tried to explain that once she got past the lower slabs, the wall became extremely dangerous without ropes or technical climbing experience, but she barely seemed interested. She waved the warning off and pointed to a recently released Netflix climbing movie, saying it had convinced her the sport wasn't nearly as difficult as climbers claimed. Seeing climbing as gatekeeping gave her an explanation that protected her confidence. If experienced climbers were exaggerating the danger to keep ordinary people out, then every warning became evidence that she was right. Their concern no longer sounded like concern at all. To her, it sounded like experienced climbers trying to defend an image that only people like them belonged on walls like El Capitan. Her lack of experience wasn't something to worry about. It became proof that she wasn't trapped by the same limiting beliefs they were. The conversation became increasingly tense as the climber, clearly not getting the message, continued urging her to reconsider. Amarian interpreted the warnings as a personal affront and an attempt to keep her off the wall, accusing the group of protecting their status within the climbing community. She then threatened to report them to park rangers for harassment and discrimination, demanding to speak to their manager.
I genuinely don't know what to do with that reaction. They walked over to help her.
With that, she ended the discussion, turned toward the granite, and began climbing, confident that she knew best. Recognizing the seriousness of the situation, one member of the climbing party immediately contacted Yosemite Dispatch to report an unroped climber attempting El Capitan without visible safety equipment or technical gear. Rangers were notified, but the report also marked the beginning of a difficult reality. By the time help could be organized, Amarian was already moving higher above the ground. The first section of the wall consisted of low-angle friction slabs, steep enough to demand careful movement but shallow enough that upward progress remained possible without technical climbing, at least initially. Amarian kept her body close to the granite, occasionally placing both palms against the rock for balance as she tested each foothold before committing her weight. Her pace was slow and deliberate, but she continued gaining elevation. The climbers at the base watched in growing concern. Nearby photographers, noticing the activity below, redirected their cameras toward the lower face. Images taken during this period show Amarian moving cautiously across the pale granite, pausing frequently as the angle gradually increased.
I can picture those pauses standing out more clearly in the photos than they probably felt in the moment.
Her new climbing shoes provided grip, but not the experience needed to use them effectively. Having never been broken in or tested on rock, they offered little of the familiarity and tactile feedback experienced climbers rely upon to judge friction and adjust their balance. On the lower slabs, where the angle remained relatively forgiving, that limitation was enough to slow her progress but not stop it.
If it were me, I'd probably still be moving too, just because nothing has forced me to stop yet.
Within the first hour of the climb, Amarian had worked her way to roughly 90 feet above the talus, well beyond the point where simply stepping back down would remain straightforward. The higher Amarian climbed, the more the wall began to change. What had started as broad granite slabs slowly disappeared, replaced by much steeper rock. Now every step had to land on tiny edges, and every move had to be just right. It wasn't something you could simply power through anymore. It took balance, precision, and experience. She was also starting to tire, and those brand new climbing shoes still weren't something she was used to. She slipped twice.
2 slips above 100 feet without a rope. My stomach dropped just reading that.
Neither time turned into a fall, but they were close calls. Ironically, surviving those slips may have reinforced the belief that she'd been right all along. She had made mistakes that should have convinced her to turn around, yet she was still on the wall. Instead of reading those moments as warnings, it would have been easy to see them as proof that she could keep handling whatever came next. She caught herself by throwing both hands against the granite and scrambling to get her feet back underneath her. The rough rock scraped up her palms, injuries that would later show up in photos taken from the valley below. Even then, she didn't stop. Every foot she climbed made the decision harder to reverse. Turning back no longer meant simply climbing down, it meant undoing every difficult move she'd already struggled through. Without ropes or any real climbing experience, retreat may have felt even more dangerous than continuing. Continuing felt dangerous. Retreating felt impossible, so she kept going.
The logic makes a terrible kind of sense. Both directions felt dangerous, so she picked up.
About 230 feet above the base of the wall, she finally reached a spot where she couldn't just keep climbing. The route straight ahead suddenly looked much steeper, with almost nowhere obvious to grab onto. She stood on a ledge only a few inches wide, facing the wall with both hands pressed against the granite. She paused. For a few seconds, it looked like she was thinking about crossing to the right, but then she changed her mind. Instead, she started moving upward and slightly to the left, onto even steeper rock. Above roughly 230 feet, Amarian entered a section of the southeast face that experienced climbers generally avoid.
In my view, when a section has that kind of reputation, it's usually because it doesn't give you any margin for hesitation.
The granite became steeper, more broken, and offered fewer reliable features for hands and feet. Unlike the standard climbing routes nearby, this section provided almost no usable ledges where a climber could stand comfortably and rest. Every movement required continuous balance, muscle engagement, and concentration. Her pace slowed dramatically. Over the next 45 minutes, she gained only about 180 feet, pausing repeatedly to study the rock before each move. Photographs taken from the valley floor during this period consistently show her pressed close against the granite with both hands and both feet in contact with the wall. As the morning progressed, the southeast face became fully exposed to the sun. The granite warmed, the light wind offered little relief, and the growing height beneath her made every movement increasingly consequential. By then, Amarian was more than 400 feet above the talus with no simple route back to the ground. After getting the earlier report, park rangers made their way to the base of the wall and spotted Amarian high above them. They immediately called for a technical rescue team. But a rescue on El Capitan isn't something that can happen in a matter of minutes. Even if rescuers had reached the top immediately, they still couldn't simply pull her to safety. They first had to build anchors, rig hundreds of feet of rope, and descend to wherever she happened to be. Every minute mattered, but the rescue could only work if she stayed where she was. From the ground, the rangers kept calling up to Amarian, telling her to stay exactly where she was and wait for the rescue team. They repeated the instructions several times.
They're shouting up 400 feet of open granite. I keep thinking about how small those voices must have sounded.
But she didn't stay put. Whether she believed she could still climb out on her own or simply didn't think the situation was as serious as everyone else did, she kept trying to move. For more than an hour though, she remained almost exactly where she was, about 410 feet above the talus. Photos taken from the valley floor show only small changes in her position. Most of the time, she stayed pressed against the granite, unable to make any real progress either up or down. By then, she had exhausted the 32 ounces of water she had brought with her.
32 ounces in full sun on hot granite in June.
The southeast face was fully exposed to the late morning sun, leaving her on hot granite without shade, without water, and without any practical place to rest. She remained more than 400 feet above the talus without water, climbing equipment, or any practical route down. Rangers continued calling for her to remain where she was, while the technical rescue team worked into position above, but no one could reach her from the ground. Photographs from this period show her almost motionless against the granite, likely stewing over the incompetence of the park staff for not getting to her sooner. Shortly before noon, Amarian began climbing again. Rather than attempting to descend, as any reasonable person would, she continued upward, moving cautiously across increasingly steep granite, convinced that she knew better than the rangers below. Over the next 20 minutes, Amarian somehow climbed another 60 feet, but by now, the wall had changed completely. It was almost vertical, and every move depended on tiny edges, thin cracks in the granite, and small footholds that were easy to miss. She couldn't see the next move before making the last one. She had to shift her weight first, then search for somewhere, anywhere to place a hand or a foot.
Somehow, she kept going. I'm not going to pretend I don't feel how tight that progression is getting just hearing it described.
By the time she reached roughly 470 feet above the talus, though, she had nowhere left to go. The granite above her offered no obvious holds. She was standing on a strip of rock only a few inches wide, with both palms pressed flat against the wall just to stay balanced. She wasn't holding on to anything anymore. She was simply trying to stay on the wall.
There's no movement left in this posture, only effort to not slip.
Later, after reviewing photographs taken from the valley floor, a climbing consultant concluded that she'd reached a position where there was no practical way to continue without technical climbing equipment. Shortly after noon on June 12th, Amarian Varelis fell from the southeast face of El Capitan. Investigators later estimated she fell from somewhere between 460 and 480 feet above the talus below. The fall was witnessed by two park rangers, a member of the climbing party who had spoken with her earlier that morning, and a photographer documenting the incident from the valley floor. The photographer's camera captured the fall in a sequence of images that was later submitted to investigators as part of the official review. The photographic sequence is consistent with an initial foot slip followed almost immediately by the loss of both hand contacts. There is no indication of a prolonged slide or an attempt to regain control after the initial loss of balance. She separated from the wall and entered freefall.
I'm not going to add anything here. I'll just let that sit.
Investigators determined that her trajectory carried her away from the granite before striking the wall lower down, followed by a final impact on the talus field below. The entire fall lasted only a matter of seconds. Park rangers reached her within minutes, with emergency medical personnel arriving shortly afterward. Amarienne was pronounced dead at the scene. Following the incident, Yosemite's technical rescue team secured the base of El Capitan, while investigators began standard documentation of the scene. Witness statements were collected from the climbing party that had spoken with Amarienne before she started climbing, the park rangers who monitored the incident from below, the meadow photographer who documented much of the ascent, and other visitors who had observed portions of the event. The photographer voluntarily provided the complete sequence of images captured throughout the morning, allowing investigators to reconstruct Amarienne's movements on the wall with unusual precision. Dispatch logs also confirmed that concerns about an unroped climber had been reported hours before the fall, and that a technical rescue response had already been initiated, though the complexity of organizing a high-angle rescue on El Capitan prevented rescuers from reaching her position before the incident occurred. The Regional Medical Examiner's Office conducted a full post-mortem examination. The findings documented multiple catastrophic blunt force injuries involving the head, spine, chest, pelvis, and internal organs, consistent with a high-altitude fall involving secondary impact with the granite wall before the final impact on the talus below. Toxicology testing detected no alcohol, prescription medications, or illicit substances that would have impaired judgment or coordination.
Not that it changes anything, but it gets asked in every case, so it gets answered.
The manner of death was certified as accidental, and the cause of death was listed as multiple blunt force injuries sustained during an unroped fall from El Capitan. The investigative review found no evidence of rockfall, unstable terrain beyond the normal conditions of the route, equipment malfunction, criminal conduct, or third-party involvement. Instead, investigators concluded that the incident resulted from an attempt to climb technical granite terrain without the specialized skills, protective equipment, or climbing systems required for that environment. The review further noted that Amarienne had continued into progressively steeper sections of the wall after repeated opportunities to turn back and despite direct warnings from experienced climbers before leaving the ground. No criminal charges or civil enforcement actions were taken, and park officials issued only a routine public notice confirming a fatal climbing incident within Yosemite Valley. Was September 14th, 2015. Renata Colville was in her late 30s when this happened, and she had been climbing for several years by that point. Not decades, years. Enough time to feel genuinely confident, to have a mental list of things she had accomplished, to have developed a personality around the sport. And that right there is where things start to get complicated. Because competence and confidence are not the same thing, and Renata had a lot more of the second one than the first.
Before we get into Renata specifically, I want to paint the picture of where all of this happened because the setting matters enormously here.
We are talking about a massive granite wall in the western United States, one of the most famous climbing destinations in the world, the kind of place that draws people from every country, that shows up in documentaries, that experienced climbers dream about for years before they ever set foot on it. It is enormous in a way that is genuinely hard to describe if you have never stood at the base of it. 3,000 feet of raw stone rising straight up out of the valley floor, catching the morning light in this golden, almost absurd way that makes it look like something out of a painting. Late summer in the western mountains is a tricky time. The days are still long and warm, which makes the climbing comfortable in the early hours, but afternoon thunderstorms can roll in fast, and the temperature swings between sunrise and midday can be significant. The year this happened, sometime around 2017 or 2018, the forecast for the specific days in question was considered favorable. Clear skies, moderate temperatures, low wind, good conditions by any measure. That kind of forecast tends to bring out a lot of climbers, and this particular summer was no exception. The base of the wall and the surrounding trailheads were buzzing with activity in the days leading up to the accident. The route Renata and her partner had chosen was what climbers call a grade 5 traditional route. That label carries a lot of weight. It means the climb is long enough and serious enough that most parties are expected to sleep on the wall, to haul gear, hang in a tent rigged to the rock face, and continue the next morning. It is not a route for people who are still figuring out the basics. It demands commitment, physical endurance, sound judgment, and a lot of gear. Most experienced parties spend at least one full night on the wall, sometimes two, depending on their pace and the conditions. ropes. This is not a day hike with ropes. This is an expedition.
I have to be honest with you, I found Renata difficult to like, even as a subject.
And I think that discomfort is worth sitting with, because she was still a human being, and what happened to her was still a tragedy. But I also think sanitizing who she was would be a disservice to the actual lesson of this story.
I'm gonna tell you who she was as accurately as I can piece it together from the accounts of people who knew her, encountered her, or were present that day.
Renata was, by most accounts, the kind of person who turned every interaction into an opportunity to establish that she knew more than you. She had a background in outdoor recreation and had completed a handful of multi-pitch climbs routes that require multiple rope lengths and some level of technical skill. She was not a beginner, but she was nowhere close to being an expert on something like a major grade 5 wall. The gap between those two things is vast, and it mattered a lot. What made it worse was that Renata genuinely did not seem to believe the gap existed. In online climbing communities, she was known for leaving long, winding comments arguing that regulations were excessive, that fees were a form of exploitation, and that the dangers of climbing were routinely exaggerated by authorities who either did not understand the sport or had some other agenda. She was particularly vocal about what she called government overreach on public land. She had opinions about everything and delivered them at volume. Her climbing partner on this trip was a man named Dovin Marsh. Dovin was quieter, less experienced, and this detail matters deeply conflict averse. He had climbed with Renata before and had noticed her patterns. He knew that pushing back on her tended to create more problems than it solved, so he had developed a strategy of gentle agreement and quiet accommodation, filling in wherever she left gaps, smoothing things over with strangers she had offended, finishing tasks she started and abandoned. It was not a healthy dynamic, and it was going to have real consequences before the day was over. They arrived at the wilderness trailhead before the sun came up, which was actually the right call. Most serious parties start early to maximize daylight on the wall. The parking area was already partially full. A few headlamps bobbed around in the dark as other climbers organized their gear. There was a self-registration permit station near the trailhead, a simple kiosk where you fill out a form, tear off your copy, and go. It takes maybe 5 minutes. Most people treat it as an ordinary part of the process. Renata did not treat it as an ordinary part of the process. Before she had even finished reading the first field on the form, she was already talking loudly. The permit requirement, in her view, was a symptom of everything wrong with how public land was managed. She announced to no one in particular that nobody should need paperwork just to go for a climb, that the whole system existed so agencies could collect data and eventually justify charging people for more things, that it was an infringement on the basic right to access land that belonged to all Americans. Several other climbers nearby shifted uncomfortably. A few exchanged looks.
Nobody said anything, because what do you say to that at 5 in the morning?
She moved through the forum the way someone moves through a traffic jam aggressively, with commentary about every obstacle. The emergency contact field particularly annoyed her. She questioned aloud why anyone needed to know who to call if something went wrong.
Struck me when I first read about it as both darkly ironic and genuinely alarming.
Dovin quietly finished most of the forum while she monologued. When they finally moved away from the kiosk, a few of the other climbers let out quiet exhales.
I'm not exaggerating when I say that this kind of behavior is a warning sign. Not a moral warning sign, I mean like a practical one.
Someone who cannot move through a 5-minute bureaucratic process without turning it into a political argument is someone whose attention is already fragmented before the climb even begins. The hike to the base of the wall takes a while, and Renata used the time productively if your goal is to stay furious. She worked through a mental list of grievances as they walked. Trail maintenance signs that she found condescending, restrictions on fixed protection that she interpreted as anti-climber sentiment, a posted informational board about recent search and rescue operations in the area that, for reasons I still do not fully understand, made her angry rather than thoughtful. About halfway to the wall, they passed a volunteer steward, one of those people who donate their time to stand near popular trailheads and remind visitors about seasonal closures, wildlife nesting areas, leave no trace practices, that sort of thing. This particular volunteer, a polite young woman, mentioned that a section near the base had a seasonal closure for nesting raptors and gave them a brief description of where the boundaries were. It was the kind of information most climbers nod at and file away. Renata stopped walking. What followed was a brief but excruciating exchange in which Renata informed the volunteer that she was familiar with the rules, that she had been climbing in this area for years.
And this is the part that genuinely gets under my skin, that she had probably been climbing longer than the volunteer had even been alive.
The volunteer was a young woman, maybe mid-20s, and she handled the whole thing with impressive patience. words. She smiled, said she understood, and wished them a good climb. Renata walked away, still muttering. Dovin said nothing. There is something particularly telling about that interaction. The volunteer was not accusing Renata of anything. She was giving the same information to every climber who passed. Renata's response tells you something important. She was not actually reacting to what was being said. She was reacting to the feeling of being addressed at all, of being included in a general reminder, as though that implied she did not already know. Her ego was the trigger. And once it was triggered, it did not easily reset. By the time they reached the base of the wall, the light had shifted from gray to gold, and other climbers were already there, sorting through enormous haul bags, organizing protection, double-checking systems. There is a particular kind of focused, quiet energy at the base of a serious climb, and most of the people there were deep in it, methodical, unhurried, thorough. Renata and Dovin's setup looked different. Their rack, the collection of gear they would use to protect themselves on the wall, was noticeably smaller than what the other parties had. Their supplies were lean. There was no emergency bivouac equipment visible, no extra layers for the cold that comes at altitude after the sun drops, minimal emergency provisions of any kind. This caught the eye of a climbing ranger who was doing routine patrol in the area. His name is Officer Breslin. He was doing his job that day, and what happened between him and Renata is one of the most important parts of this story. Breslin was experienced. He had seen a lot of parties at the base of this wall, and he had a well-developed sense of what a prepared party looked like versus what a party that was going to need help looked like. Renata and Dovin fell pretty clearly into the second category. He approached them the way rangers are trained to approach climbers, not accusatorially, not dramatically, but conversationally. He asked what route they were planning, whether they intended to push through in a single day, or planned to bivouac on the wall, and what their planned turnaround time was. These are standard questions. They are designed to open a dialogue, not to catch anyone out. Then he explained what he had observed over the years on this particular route. It was longer and more demanding than many people expected going in. Several parties in recent years had needed assistance, some due to equipment issues, some due to exhaustion, some due to weather that moved in faster than the forecast had suggested. Afternoon conditions at elevation could change in ways that were hard to predict. Retreat became genuinely difficult after certain pitches because of the nature of the terrain. He recommended they carry more water. He recommended an emergency shelter. He suggested a more conservative approach to timing. He was measured, specific, and professional. And then Renata started talking.
I want to be clear that I understand the experience of feeling like an authority figure is underestimating you.
I think most of us have been in a situation where someone in a position of power spoke to us as though we were less capable than we actually are, and it feels bad. It can make you defensive in a way that is genuinely hard to control. I understand that impulse. But that is not what was happening here. Breslin was looking at a rack that was objectively under-equipped for what they were planning. He was delivering information that was factually accurate. And even if Renata had disagreed with his assessment, there were about 40 different ways she could have handled it that did not involve what she actually did. She interrupted him before he had finished his recommendations. She accused him of profiling climbers, of looking at them and making assumptions about their competence without any basis. She told him that warnings like this were unnecessary, that public employees always assumed climbers were incompetent, that the whole encounter was a form of intimidation designed to scare people away from the routes they had every right to climb. Her voice got louder. The climbers nearby stopped pretending not to listen. Some of them watched openly. Breslin remained calm. He said, clearly and without escalating, that he was only providing safety information and that they were free to make their own choices. This did not help. Renata raised her voice further. She used the word harassment. She said she knew her rights. She said she paid taxes for this land. She demanded to see his identification, asked for his supervisor's name, and requested information on how to file a formal complaint. The confrontation stretched on for several minutes, much longer than it needed to, much longer than Breslin wanted it to go, and much longer than any of the nearby climbers were comfortable watching. Eventually, Breslin disengaged. Before he walked away, he told them to climb safely. It was a small thing to say, and he said it quietly, but I think about it a lot. He walked away from that interaction knowing there was a real possibility he had just spoken to someone for the last time.
I don't know what that feels like, but I imagine it's pretty heavy.
A few climbers nearby made quiet comments to each other about how the ranger had just been doing his job. Nobody said it to Renata directly, and Renata, still vibrating with fury, began organizing her gear.
Here's the thing about anger that I find genuinely fascinating from a psychological standpoint. It doesn't just live in the moment.
It spreads. It bleeds into the next 30 minutes, the next hour. It fragments your attention in ways you are often not even aware of. Renata was angry in a way that had nowhere to go, and so it went everywhere. For the next half hour, she kept returning to the confrontation. She rehearsed what she was going to write in her complaint. She talked about reporting the ranger. She made a series of increasingly wide claims about how the climbing community was being strangled by regulation, about how public land management had become hostile to individual freedom, about how encounters like this one were a symptom of a much larger problem. Dovin listened and offered small, non-committal sounds of agreement. He was not processing any of it. He was waiting for it to stop. Then another climber, a friendly, well-meaning guy who had been nearby during part of the ranger confrontation, made the mistake of suggesting that Renata might want to consider carrying more water because the temperature was expected to climb significantly through the morning. He said it gently. He said it the way you say something to a stranger that you think might genuinely help them. Renata told him she did not ask for advice, and that everyone suddenly seemed to think they were an expert. He walked away without responding.
I think he made the right call. You can't reason someone out of a state that they didn't reason themselves into.
What I want you to notice is how much energy Renata was burning on all of this. Emotional energy, cognitive energy, attention, all of it was going toward the ranger, toward the complaint she was drafting in her head, toward proving a point that no one around her actually needed her to prove. None of it was going toward what she was about to do, which was tie into a rope and step onto a 3,000-foot wall. There is a concept in psychology sometimes called attentional narrowing, where a strong emotional state causes your focus to collapse inward. You stop processing your environment accurately because your brain is too busy processing the emotional event. It happens to everyone. It happens to surgeons, to pilots, to athletes. The research on it is pretty clear. Strong negative emotions degrade performance on tasks that require careful attention, especially procedural tasks where you are working through a checklist or a sequence of steps. Climbing preparation is almost entirely procedural. You follow a sequence, you check things in a specific order. When that sequence gets disrupted by an emotion that has nowhere to go, errors creep in. Renata was not stupid. She was not careless in some fundamental character sense. She was a person in the grip of a strong emotional state, doing a task that required something she no longer had available to give. By the time they actually sat down to prepare their gear, Renata was behind the mental pace you need to be at before a serious climb. She was rushing through the process not dramatically, not visibly to someone who did not know her, but in ways that Dovin noticed. Her usual methodical approach to sorting protection and checking equipment was abbreviated. Things ended up in the wrong pockets. Steps that she normally followed in a specific order got shuffled or skipped. She was thinking about the ranger. She was thinking about her complaint. She was thinking about everything except what was directly in front of her. Dovin noticed. He noticed that she seemed distracted, that she kept circling back to the confrontation mid-task, that her normally careful rhythm was off. He suggested they take a short break before starting. Just sit down, breathe, let the morning settle. It was a good suggestion. It was, in fact, exactly what they needed to do. Renata refused. She said they needed to get moving.
I'm not going to pretend I don't understand Dovin's position here.
He was in a relationship, a climbing partnership, but with all the social weight that any long-term partnership carries with someone who was not in a place to receive gentle redirection. He had tried. She had said no. What do you do? I am not sure I know the answer, but I think it is worth sitting with the fact that he saw the warning signs and could not find a way to act on them. That is its own kind of tragedy layered inside the main one. This is the part I need you to pay close attention to, because it is the most technically important part of the story, and also the part where everything becomes irreversible. When you climb a technical route and tie yourself to the rope, you use a specific knot called a rethreaded figure-8 follow-through. It is also called a figure-8 on a bite, or sometimes just a rewoven figure-8. The name is descriptive. You tie a figure-8 shape in the rope, then thread the tail back through the original knot, retracing its path until the finished product looks like a symmetric, doubled figure-8 pressed flat. It is the standard tie-in knot used by the vast majority of rock climbers worldwide. It is simple, strong, reliable, and almost impossible to get wrong if you do it slowly and pay attention. Almost. Renata began tying in, and while she was doing it, she was talking. She was still processing the ranger confrontation, still working through the argument, still rehearsing lines. She threaded the rope through her harness tie-in points and started forming the figure-8. Then her attention drifted back to the morning's events. She paused, mid-process, to say something to Dovin. Then she came back to the knot and continued, or rather, she thought she continued. What she actually did was pick up from a point in the process that was not where she had left off. She believed she had finished rethreading the knot. She had not. The tail of the rope had not been fully traced back through the original figure-8. The resulting knot was not obviously wrong. It was a partially completed figure-8 follow-through, and at a casual glance, especially partially obscured by the harness and the extra rope, it looked close enough to correct that she did not catch it. Because she believed she had already finished the knot, it did not occur to her to look carefully. She did not check it a second time. And then there was the buddy check, which is exactly what it sounds like. You check each other. Harness buckles doubled back, belay device rigged correctly, tie-in knot completed, and dressed properly. You look at your partner's setup and they look at yours, and you confirm out loud that everything is in order. It is one of the most fundamental safety practices in climbing. It exists precisely because of moments like this one, moments where distraction or assumption might cause someone to miss their own error. The buddy check is the backstop. Neither of them did it. Dovin did not check Renata's knot. Renata did not ask him to. Whether this was because the whole morning had been too chaotic, or because she was too proud to invite scrutiny after the argument about competence, or simply because the normal rhythm of preparation had been disrupted by everything that came before, I do not know. Probably some combination. But the rope was tied, or seemed to be tied, and they started climbing. The first few pitches went fine. This is the most uncomfortable part of the story for me, honestly, because it means there was a long window during which they could have caught the mistake and did not. Each successful pitch reinforced the belief that everything was working correctly. Renata climbed confidently. The knot was not subjected to the kind of sudden, heavy loading that would have immediately exposed the problem. The early pitches did not require her to take any significant falls. She moved well, placed protection, called out to Dovin, hauled gear, everything looked normal. As they moved higher, the wall changed character. The terrain became more serious. Retreat stopped being a realistic option. Several pitches up, not impossible, but complicated enough that most parties at that point committed to continuing upward. And here is the uncomfortable reality of how commitment works on a big wall. There is a point where going down costs roughly the same effort as going up, and then a point where going down costs more. Once you cross that second threshold, you are psychologically and practically all in. Every foot of elevation you gain deepens that commitment. Renata and Dovin had passed that threshold without either of them saying so out loud. They were hundreds of feet above the ground by this point. Fully invested, the valley floor spread out far below them in that vertiginous way that either thrills you or terrifies you depending on your relationship with height.
I have never been that high on a wall, and I genuinely can't imagine what the world actually looks like from up there. But I know that at that altitude, the margin for error is essentially zero.
The unfinished knot had been there the whole time, waiting. They reached a section that was harder than what they had been climbing, a stretch where the rock offered fewer obvious holds, where the moves required more precision, where a moment of imbalance was easier to come by. Renata was working through it. At some point, she shifted her weight in a way that took her off balance, and she fell. Under normal circumstances, this would be an ordinary event. Climbers fall, the rope catches them, they collect themselves, rest for a moment, and try again. The entire system, the knot, the harness, the protection on the wall, the belay device in Dovin's hands, is designed for exactly this scenario. But the knot was not a knot. It was a shape that resembled a knot. When Renata's weight came onto the rope suddenly and with force, the incomplete figure eight deformed. Under load, a partially retraced figure eight does not hold the way a completed one does. The tail pulled through, the rope disconnected from her harness. She fell from the wall. Climbers on adjacent routes heard it before they saw it, shouting not the normal communication shouts between climbing partners, but something sharper, more alarmed. They looked toward the route. Several of them were on the phone with emergency services before they could fully process what they had seen. Dovin, above on the belay, was unable to comprehend immediately what had happened. The rope had gone slack in a way that made no sense. For a moment, he simply did not understand. Search and rescue personnel responded as quickly as the terrain allowed. The area around the accident site was temporarily closed. Investigators arrived and began the methodical work of reconstructing what had happened. The physical evidence was clear. The rope was intact. The harness showed no signs of failure. The protection on the wall held. When they examined the tie-in, they found what they had feared. A figure eight follow-through that had never been completed. The tail had not been fully traced back through the original knot. It was a preparation error, not an equipment failure. Nothing had broken. The gear had done nothing wrong.
I've thought a lot about what this story means, and I keep coming back to the same uncomfortable place.
The incomplete knot was the technical cause of the accident, but it didn't happen in isolation. It was tied by someone whose attention had been consumed by anger, who dismissed advice and treated every warning as an attack. June 27, 2020, in Sedona, Arizona, on a stretch of land called the West Fork Trail, when two young people set out for what they thought would be an easy afternoon hike to a swimming hole they had seen on TikTok. There was no single moment where the universe just decided these two were doomed. They walked themselves there, decision by decision, joke by joke. What makes this case so useful to talk about, in a strange way, is exactly how ordinary the setup was. This wasn't some extreme expedition. It wasn't a technical climb or a backcountry route requiring permits and gear lists. It was a popular, well-known trail near a tourist town, the kind of place thousands of people visit safely every single year. That's part of why this story spread the way it did once the details came out. People could picture themselves doing the same thing, going on the same kind of casual day trip, and that made the ending hit a lot closer to home for a lot of listeners. The two people at the center of this story were Jacob Soverall, 24 years old, a forklift operator at a warehouse, and his girlfriend Briar Moreno, who went by Bri, 22 years old, a receptionist at a dental office. From what investigators and people who knew them described, Jacob was the competitive type. He hated being told what to do, and he had a reputation among friends for treating warning labels and safety signs as something that existed purely so companies could avoid getting sued, not because the warnings were actually true. Bri, on the other hand, spent a huge amount of her free time on TikTok, constantly saving travel and nature videos. She had developed this belief that social media was basically a backdoor into secret places that locals supposedly didn't want tourists to find. Neither of them had any real hiking background. Their experience came from short, paved nature trails near where they lived, nothing that would have prepared them for a canyon trail in the Arizona heat.
Now, judging them from the start, I think this combination of personalities is honestly more dangerous than either one alone.
You take someone who already distrusts authority and pair them with someone who genuinely believes she's found a hidden gem the rest of the world hasn't discovered yet, and you get this weird cocktail of overconfidence. Neither one is going to be the voice of reason for the other, because they're both feeding into the same fantasy.
I've seen this pattern in some other cases I've covered, and it almost always ends the same way.
The trip itself started the way so many of these stories do, with a video. Bri had seen dozens of TikTok clips showing this crystal clear pool tucked beneath bright red canyon walls, and she convinced Jacob that they needed to go see it for themselves. Neither of them researched the West Fork Trail before driving out there, neither of them downloaded offline maps in case they lost cell signal, neither of them checked the weather forecast for that day, and neither of them looked up how long the trail actually was or where it led. They just got in the car and drove.
What they packed tells you almost everything you need to know about how unprepared they were.
Each of them brought a single 20-ounce bottle of water, which honestly wouldn't be enough for a brisk walk around a neighborhood on a hot day, let alone a canyon hike. They brought a bag of chips, a phone power bank, a selfie stick, a Bluetooth speaker, and a pair of flip-flops stuffed in a backpack so they could swim once they reached the pool from the video. There were no electrolyte drinks, no hats, no emergency supplies of any kind, no first aid kit, no extra layers, nothing. When you actually lay out that list item by item, it almost reads like a checklist for a backyard party rather than a hike through a desert canyon. A speaker for music, a stick for taking pictures, snacks meant for casual snacking rather than sustained energy. Not one item on that list was chosen with the actual environment in mind. It was chosen entirely around the experience they imagined they were about to have, which was a quick, scenic, social media-friendly outing, not a physically demanding trek through exposed terrain in triple-digit heat.
And if you think that's crazy, wait until you see what they brought with them.
A Bluetooth speaker and a selfie stick made the cut, but electrolyte packets and a hat didn't even come up as an afterthought. This wasn't a hike to them, it was a content trip. The entire purpose of the day was built around capturing footage, not around actually surviving the terrain they were about to walk into.
And I think that's a mindset a lot of people fall into now without even realizing it.
You're not planning a hike. You're planning a video, and the actual physical reality of the desert just doesn't factor into the planning at all. Before they even stepped onto the trail, there was a moment in the parking lot that, in hindsight, basically wrote the headline for this whole story. A retired couple was nearby and overheard Bri telling Jacob that the warning signs posted near the trailhead were meant for old people, not for someone like her. She said this while laughing and pointing toward the safety board that listed heat warnings and trail information. Around the same time, Jacob noticed a park ranger talking with another group of hikers nearby, and he made a comment dismissing rangers as basically paid babysitters. The retired couple later told investigators they remembered both comments clearly, mostly because they found them so rude and dismissive at the time.
I think that exchange is almost too on the nose, the kind of thing that you'd roll your eyes at if it showed up in a movie script because it feels too convenient.
But it happened in real life, witnessed by strangers who had no reason to make it up, and it happened minutes before two people walked into a canyon and never came back out alive. There's something almost eerie about how casually dismissive both of them were toward the exact systems designed to keep people like them safe. The first section of the West Fork Trail is maintained, shaded by canyon walls and tree cover, and runs alongside a cool creek. By all accounts, this part of the hike felt easy. The temperature was manageable, the path was clear, and nothing about it suggested any kind of danger. But here's the problem with an easy start. It builds a false sense of confidence. Because the hike felt effortless in those first sections, Jacob and Bree became even more sure of themselves, more convinced that whatever lay ahead would be just as manageable.
Before you make the same mistake they did, I'll have you know that this is one of the most underrated dangers in outdoor recreation.
A trail that eases you in gently doesn't warn you about what's coming later, it just lulls you into believing the entire experience is going to feel the same way it does in those first 15 or 20 minutes. People don't usually get hurt on the hardest, most obviously dangerous parts of a trail because those parts trigger a kind of natural caution. It's the deceptively easy stretches that quietly set people up to underestimate everything that follows. They stopped repeatedly along this shaded stretch to film TikTok clips, even though neither of them had any real plan to post the footage professionally or build any kind of platform around it. It was just something to do, a habit baked into how they experienced anything scenic. Bri kept replaying one particular saved video on her phone, the one showing the secluded swimming pool that had started this whole trip. Every so often she would tell Jacob they were almost there, even though the video itself never once mentioned how far into the canyon that pool actually was.
This is where I have to bring up something that bothers me about a lot of viral travel content. These videos almost never include the actual difficulty of getting somewhere.
No mileage, no elevation, no warning about exposure to heat, nothing about how the trail conditions change once you're an hour in. It's all the destination and none of the journey, and that gives people a wildly distorted sense of what they're walking into. Bree wasn't necessarily being reckless on purpose. She had consumed dozens of clips that made this look easy and quick, and there was nothing in her information diet correcting that impression. Not long after, a family with 2 young children passed them heading the opposite direction. The father gave them a piece of practical advice, suggesting they turn back before noon, because temperatures would rise sharply once hikers left the deepest shade and spent more time in the exposed sections beyond the maintained trail. Jacob brushed this off, responding with a joke about not trying to speedrun retirement, implying they had plenty of time and energy left. The family continued on their way, and the father later told investigators that the couple had seemed annoyed by any advice offered to them, as if being warned was somehow an insult rather than a kindness.
There's a difference between ignoring a warning because you didn't hear it clearly and ignoring a warning because you're irritated that someone offered it in the first place.
The second one suggests a mindset where any caution from a stranger feels like a personal attack on your competence. And once you're in that headspace, you're not just ignoring information, you're actively rejecting help that's being handed to you for free by people who have nothing to gain from lying. Eventually, the maintained section of the West Fork Trail came to its official end. There was no swimming hole in sight, nothing matching what Bree had seen online. Instead of treating this as a sign they had misjudged the location or distance, Bree became convinced the pool from the video was just a little farther ahead. They noticed faint unofficial footpaths continuing past the maintained trail, and because those paths looked well used, they assumed that meant they were heading in the right direction. This is the first real fork in the road, both literally and figuratively, and it's the first bad decision that investigators later flagged as a turning point. Instead of pulling out a map, checking trail information, or simply accepting that the official trail had ended for a reason, they followed random footprints into unmarked terrain. Several of these social trails split off in different directions, and rather than stopping to think it through, they simply picked whichever path had the freshest looking footprints or the clearest opening through the brush. Each choice took them farther from the maintained trail and farther from any kind of safety net.
I think it's easy to listen to this and assume you'd never make the same mistake, but unofficial trails exist precisely because they look convincing.
They're not random scuffs in the dirt, they're paths worn down by enough previous hikers that they look legitimate. The problem is that well used doesn't mean lead somewhere safe. It just means other people walked there too, and some of those people might have turned back, and some of them might not have known where they were going either. It's worth pointing out here just how easy it is for a place like this to accumulate dozens of these informal paths over the years. Curious hikers wander a little farther than they planned. Animals carve their own routes looking for water, and seasonal flooding rearranges the landscape every year, opening up new gaps in the brush that look exactly like a trail to someone who isn't paying close attention. None of that is obvious from the ground when you're standing there in the moment, sweating, excited, and convinced you're close to something amazing. It only becomes obvious afterward, when investigators map it all out from above. From this point on, the unofficial route required repeatedly crossing the the creek, and Jacob and Bree began using slightly different crossing points each time because they simply weren't paying close attention anymore. Their shoes became soaked from the repeated crossings, and the wet fabric increased friction against their skin, slowly creating blisters with every step. They joked about it at the time, framing the whole detour as exploring rather than as a warning sign that they had lost track of the actual trail.
Blisters sounds like a minor annoyance, the kind of thing that you'd shrug off on a normal day, but out in conditions like this, they're not just uncomfortable.
They're a slow drain on your ability to keep moving efficiently. Every extra bit of pain in your feet changes how you walk, makes you favor one side over the other, and adds fatigue on top of fatigue. None of that shows up as a dramatic crisis in the moment. It just quietly stacks on top of everything else that was already working against them, making the eventual walk back, the one they never ended up taking, that much harder than it would have been a few hours earlier. Around this stage, two experienced hikers returning from farther upstream crossed paths with them. One of the hikers told them directly that there was nothing official beyond that point. The other added that people get turned around out there every single summer, a clear and specific warning based on real, repeated incidents. Bree responded by saying that was exactly what made it worth finding, framing the danger itself as part of the appeal. Jacob laughed it off and again referred to park rangers, this time adding that they panic every time someone walks off the trail. These two hikers later identified Jacob and Bree from news photographs after the story broke.
I have to say, hearing that someone gets turned around there every summer and responding that this is what makes it worth finding is one of the most unsettling exchanges in this entire case to me.
That's not naivety anymore. That's treating other people's documented suffering as a selling point. It tells me that by this stage, the thrill of finding something hidden had completely overridden their ability to process direct, specific, repeated warnings from people with first-hand experience in that exact canyon. What strikes me about this particular exchange compared to the earlier ones is just how specific and credible the warning was. This wasn't a generic sign posted by a government agency, and it wasn't a stranger's vague opinion. These were two people who had personally just walked through that exact terrain coming from the opposite direction, offering first-hand and very recent information. If there was ever a moment built specifically to override the overconfidence that had carried them this far, it was this one, and it still didn't work. Beyond this point, there was no more maintained trail, no trail markers, nothing but faint footprints scattered across the landscape. They encountered numerous dead ends, game trails left by animals, dry washes that looked like paths but led nowhere, and stretches that all began to look identical no matter which direction they faced. The creek kept disappearing behind bends in the canyon, reappearing and vanishing again, making it nearly impossible to use it as a reliable point of reference. By late morning, both of them had finished most of the water in their single bottles. Instead of recognizing this as the moment to turn back, they decided to ration their remaining water by taking small sips here and there, treating it like a manageable inconvenience rather than a serious warning sign. Meanwhile, the afternoon temperature outside the canyon climbed toward 100 degrees Fahrenheit. Beyond the maintained trail, they spent longer stretches directly exposed to sunlight, with very limited airflow moving through the canyon. Continuous hiking under those conditions steadily raised both of their core body temperatures, even though neither of them could feel that process happening in real time. This is honestly the scariest part of heat-related illness to me. The fact that it doesn't announce itself clearly. There's no dramatic moment where your body sends up a flare and tells you to stop immediately. It's gradual, it's sneaky, and by the time the obvious symptoms show up, like confusion or a complete stop in sweating, a huge amount of damage has usually already been done internally. Running out of water doesn't feel like an emergency in the moment. It feels like an inconvenience you can manage with a little discipline, right up until your body simply can't keep up with the demand anymore. This next stretch of the story doesn't have any outside witnesses. Everything from here forward comes from investigators piecing together what happened using phone GPS data, timestamps embedded in photographs, step count records pulled from their phones, recovered text message drafts that were never sent, location history, and footprints found near multiple creek crossings. According to that reconstructed data, they spent nearly 2 hours wandering within less than 1 mile of total distance because they kept doubling back without realizing it.
I can't imagine myself spending 2 hours in less than a mile. They weren't even making progress toward anything.
They were trapped in a loop of their own confusion, burning energy and water and time while believing they were closing in on a destination that was nowhere near where they thought it was. Even though their phones still had battery remaining, they avoided opening any mapping apps, partly because they wanted to preserve battery life for filming, and partly because they assumed they could navigate from memory alone. Every bend in the canyon looked familiar to them in the moment, but none of them actually were the same bend they remembered. At one point, they briefly discussed turning around, but Bree insisted they were literally right there, just on the verge of finding the pool. Confirmation bias kept pulling them forward, and with every additional minute spent moving deeper into the canyon, the idea of turning back became physically and psychologically harder to accept. As the heat continued building, you can see its effects start to show up in the data itself. Their pace slowed down, conversations, based on the text they had been drafting, became shorter and less frequent. The photographs stopped, the videos stopped, phone activity nearly ceased entirely. Investigators later noted that this drop-off in activity lined up directly with the hottest part of the afternoon, which strongly suggests that heat was already beginning to affect their ability to think clearly and make decisions. It's genuinely chilling to read about a moment like that from the outside, looking back at a timeline and watching the activity just trail off into nothing, knowing that somewhere in that silence is the exact point where two people stopped being able to save themselves and didn't even know it. At some point during this stretch, they encountered a series of stagnant pools of water. Instead of recognizing this as a clear sign that they had wandered away from the main travel corridor and away from any reliable water source, they convinced themselves this meant they were close to the swimming hole from the TikTok video. So they kept going deeper into the canyon, chasing a destination that, as far as anyone can tell, may never have actually existed in the location they thought it did. Physically, things were falling apart by now. Jacob developed painful leg cramps, a classic sign of dehydration and electrolyte loss. Bri complained of dizziness. Both of them began sweating less, even though they were still exerting themselves, which is one of the more dangerous signs of heat stroke, because it means the body's cooling system is starting to fail. Their skin grew increasingly hot to the touch, and their movements slowed noticeably. They repeatedly stopped in whatever patches of shade they could find, believing that a few minutes of rest would be enough to reset everything and let them continue on. Instead, their core body temperatures kept climbing the entire time.
Whenever people hear symptoms like cramps and dizziness, I understand that it's easy to assume that those are early warning signs with plenty of time to spare.
By the point your body stops sweating properly in extreme heat, you're already deep into a medical emergency, not approaching the edge of one. Stopping in the shade for a few minutes might feel like progress, like you're doing the responsible thing, but if you're not also rehydrating with actual fluids and electrolytes, you're essentially pausing the clock without actually fixing the underlying problem. Their bodies needed water and rest in a cool environment for an extended period, not a brief pause in the same hot canyon air. At one especially heartbreaking point in the reconstructed timeline, they actually reached a creek crossing they had already used earlier that day. Rather than recognizing this as proof that they had looped back on themselves, they assumed it must be a brand new crossing, since by this point every part of the canyon looked the same to them. They unknowingly walked away from what would have been the shortest possible route back to the maintained trail and to safety. It's frustrating to know how close that moment actually was. They were standing at a literal opportunity to retrace their steps to safety, and their own exhausted, overheated minds steered them away from it, without either of them realizing what had just happened. That's not a failure of willpower at that point. That's their bodies failing them in a way that took the decision out of their hands entirely. As the day wore on, the phone location updates became increasingly sparse, as the devices entered low power mode and lost reliable satellite signal beneath the canyon walls. The very last photograph recovered from their phones showed nothing but a plain canyon wall, with no identifiable trail or landmark visible anywhere in the frame. No further movement was recorded after that point. Investigators ultimately concluded that both Jacob and Bree became incapable of making rational navigation decisions due to severe dehydration combined with exertional heat stroke, meaning their bodies had essentially shut down their ability to think their way back out. A family member reported them missing after they failed to return home that evening, and search teams assembled at sunrise the next morning. Search and rescue personnel eventually located both of them approximately 3 miles beyond the official end of the maintained West Fork Trail. Their backpacks were found with the chips still untouched inside. The flip-flops they had packed for swimming were never worn. The water bottles recovered nearby were nearly empty, just like the data had suggested they would be.
To me, those untouched items hit harder than almost anything else, because you can immediately picture the normal day that they thought they were going to have.
There's something almost cruel about those untouched chips and unused flip-flops. They're small, ordinary objects that were supposed to be part of a fun, relaxed afternoon, and instead they just sat there in the heat as evidence of a day that never went the way it was supposed to. Investigators ultimately concluded that both deaths resulted from environmental heat exposure, complicated by exertional heat stroke and dehydration, following prolonged physical exertion and becoming disoriented beyond the maintained trail. In the aftermath, The retired couple from the parking lot, the father who had warned them about the rising afternoon heat, and the two experienced hikers who had crossed their path later in the canyon all gave statements to investigators and to local media describing the same pattern: two young people who repeatedly dismissed trail safety advice and referred to park rangers as overpaid babysitters. Those specific remarks became a recurring detail in local news coverage of the case, largely because they stood in such sharp, almost unbearable contrast to the actual circumstances of how Jacob and Bree died. That's ultimately what makes this story land the way it does. It's not just a tragic accident in the desert, and it's not just two people who got unlucky with timing or weather. It's a story built almost entirely out of small, dismissive choices, made by two people who had convinced themselves that the systems meant to protect hikers, the signs, the rangers, the experienced strangers offering free advice on the trail, were somehow beneath them or irrelevant to their situation. Every single warning they received that day turned out to be accurate, and every single time, they chose to laugh it off instead. What stays with me most isn't even the heat or the wrong turns or the looping paths through the canyon. It's the parking lot moment. The joke about overpaid babysitters, made just minutes before they walked past the very people whose job it was to keep them alive out there. I don't think either of them believed, even for a second, that those words would end up defining how their story was told. But that's exactly what happened. And it's a reminder that the advice we brush off the easiest is so often the advice that mattered the most. It was June 28th, 2018. Panamint Valley, California. A flat open basin of gravel and salt flats pressed between two mountain ranges, sitting at roughly 1,100 feet above sea level with no shade anywhere on the floor and no water anywhere on the surface. A heat warning had been in effect for the region since June 26th. Furnace Creek, 20 miles to the northeast, had already hit 122 degrees the day before. It was going to get worse. Jeevan Driscoll was 46 years old. He grew up in Odessa and went straight into the oil fields after high school. Over the next 2 decades, he worked his way up from roughneck to crew supervisor and eventually built his own independent contracting outfit operating across the Permian Basin. By 2018, the business had reached a solid mid-sized scale. He was servicing active drill sites across West Texas, managing crews, bidding contracts, and keeping equipment running in conditions most people would consider genuinely brutal. And the conditions really were brutal. Summers in the Permian Basin run hot from May through September. 12-hour shifts on open drill pads in temperatures that regularly hit 105 or 108 degrees, all while wearing flame-resistant clothing that trapped heat against the body. There were hourly breaks, cooling trailers on the better run sites, and constant hydration protocols. Heat stress was a known part of the job. Heavy sweating, nausea, dizziness, and Driscoll had spent nearly 20 years working through it himself and helping crews do the same. He wasn't a man who spent his days in an air-conditioned office. He was physically fit, a non-smoker, and usually ran a few miles in the mornings when he was between contracts. To him, suffering through heat wasn't some abstract thing that people wrote books about. It was part of the job. The Death Valley crossing had been on his mind for about 8 months. He talked about it to people around him as a personal benchmark, something physical, something most people couldn't do, something that had nothing to do with work, money, or managing other people. Just him and the terrain. He took the planning seriously. He read first-hand accounts, studied routes, and spent time understanding what a crossing like that actually involved. Once he felt he had a handle on it, he went looking for the best guide he could find, and he found one. The guide he hired had spent more than 15 years running private backcountry trips in Death Valley. He was fully authorized to operate there and had the experience to back it up. He'd completed versions of the same corridor crossing before, always during the cooler months and always with clients who stuck to the schedule. The fee came to $80,000. That covered custom gear, pre-cached supply waypoints at 3 locations along the route, satellite communication equipment, and a fully mapped corridor from the Panamint Valley floor eastward to stovepipe wells over 3 days. Driscoll paid without negotiating. The way he saw it, writing the check wasn't the hard part. The hard part was still waiting for him out in the desert. The pre-trip briefing happened 2 weeks before departure. The guide walked Driscoll through the route in detail: daily distances, waypoint locations, the water allocation schedule, the movement windows, the midday halt protocol. He explained the reasoning behind every element. He was direct about the forecast window they were entering. Late June in Death Valley is not a gray area. It is the most dangerous time of year in one of the most dangerous places in the country, and the guide said exactly that. Driscoll's response, according to the guide's later account, was measured. He asked good questions. He engaged with the logistics. but he kept returning to the schedule, specifically to the midday halt windows he said he'd worked through worse. The guide told him that what he'd worked through and what they were walking into were not the same thing.
It's a surprisingly common mistake. Experience with one kind of hardship can make people assume that they're prepared for a completely different one.
The Panamint Valley floor sits at roughly 1,100 feet above sea level, caught between two mountain ranges that trap and compress hot air against the ground around the clock. The basin absorbs solar radiation all day and releases it slowly through the night. In late June 2018, overnight lows in the region were holding between 88 and 95 degrees Fahrenheit. Think about what that means for a moment. The coolest it got, at any point during the night, was nearly 90 degrees. There was no recovery window. The body never got a chance to reset. Every morning, Driscoll woke up already behind. The human body's core temperature sits at around 98.6 degrees. It starts struggling above 102. Heat exhaustion, heavy sweating, weakness, nausea, rapid pulse typically appears between 101 and 104 degrees. Heat stroke, where the body's cooling system begins to fail, starts above 104. Once that line is crossed, things can unravel quickly. Confusion comes first, then disorientation. Then the loss of coordination. Eventually, the body stops being able to do basic things it normally takes for granted. What most people don't realize is that the brain starts slipping long before that point. Even mild dehydration can impair attention, concentration, and short-term memory. Navigation becomes less reliable. Decisions take longer. The brain starts missing things it would normally catch. And in Death Valley, during a record heat event, that decline doesn't announce itself. It happens quietly while you're still convinced you're fine. A man who has worked in 108-degree heat in West Texas has no physiological advantage in 129-degree air over a valley floor, radiating over 160 degrees at his feet. The body does not build tolerance to temperatures that exceed its ability to cool itself. It just fails faster or slower depending on hydration, exertion level, and how long the exposure lasts. Driscoll had spent 20 years believing he was heat-hardened. He wasn't wrong about West Texas. He was completely wrong about Death Valley.
What made Driscoll vulnerable wasn't a lack of competence. In some ways, it was the confidence that competence had earned him.
The guide's plan was built around one non-negotiable rule: no movement between 9 a.m. and 6 p.m. The morning window ran from 3:30 to 8:30. 5 hours of movement in pre-dawn and early morning conditions before the valley floor became untenable. He carried 2 portable shade shelters specifically designed for midday halts in exposed terrain. Water was allocated at 1 liter per hour of movement, the minimum for extreme heat conditions, with mandatory electrolyte intake at every rest stop. 3 pre-cached waypoints along the route held additional supply. Every single element of that plan existed because the guide had spent 15 years watching what this place does when people improvise.
One thing that always surprises me about wilderness travel is how much of it comes down to restraint. Knowing when not to move can matter more than knowing how.
Day 1, June 28, 2018. The high at Furnace Creek, roughly 20 miles to the northeast, was 122 degrees. They started at 3:30 in the morning. The valley floor before dawn has a strange, disorienting quality to it. Death Valley has some of the darkest skies in the country, almost no artificial light nearby, and out on the flat open basin, the ground and horizon seem to blend together. You navigate by the dark outlines of the mountain ranges on either side, and by whatever instruments you're carrying. The guide relied on a compass and a GPS unit. Even at 3:30 a.m., the air was already 89 degrees. Not cool, not comfortable. Just less dangerous than it would be a few hours later. They covered roughly 9 miles before stopping for the midday halt and reached the first waypoint in good condition. Driscoll moved well. There was never much question about his physical capability. But throughout the morning, he kept comparing the heat to job sites in Midland and Odessa. He called the pace conservative. At one point during the midday rest, he asked whether they could keep moving through the afternoon window instead of waiting. The guide explained the reasoning again. Cumulative dehydration, ground radiation, the difference between air temperature and the radiant heat coming off the valley floor, where the ground was pushing well over 150 degrees into their legs. Driscoll listened. He didn't press the issue any further that day. But the guide made a note of it. That night, the temperature didn't drop below 90 degrees. Driscoll slept, but not deeply. The heat doesn't let you. You lie still and your body keeps working, keeps trying to regulate, keeps spending resources it needs for the next day. By the time the alarm went off, he had already been in the heat for hours without moving. Day 2, June 29th, 2018. High of 128 degrees at Furnace Creek. The guide moved the morning start to 3 a.m. to account for the climbing forecast. Driscoll was up and ready, which the guide noted positively. They moved in the pre-dawn dark across the gravel floor, headlamps cutting a narrow path through terrain that was flat but uneven loose rock, shallow wash channels, scattered low scrub that was hard to see until you were on top of it. The Panamint Range was visible to the east as a broad black mass against the slightly lighter sky. That's your landmark on the valley floor at night. A silhouette, not a precise bearing, a general direction. During the morning movement window, Driscoll started making small adjustments of his own. He skipped one of the scheduled water stops, saying he wasn't thirsty. On 2 separate stretches, he drifted slightly ahead of the pace the guide had set, not by much, maybe 30 or 40 feet, but enough for it to become noticeable. At one point, he reconfigured his pack without mentioning it. None of those things were dangerous on their own, but the guide had been doing this long enough to recognize the pattern. It usually meant a client had started believing, somewhere in the back of their mind, that they understood the situation better than the plan did. By the end of the morning window on day 2, the guide noticed a few early signs that the heat was starting to accumulate. Driscoll's resting heart rate was a little higher than it had been the day before. He had less appetite. He was slower to rehydrate during the midday halt. None of it would have been alarming by itself. With the forecast for the following day, it was enough to get the guide's attention. During the midday break, he brought up the skipped water stop directly. He reminded Driscoll that thirst isn't a reliable signal in extreme heat. By the time you actually feel thirsty, you're often already running a meaningful deficit. Driscoll said he understood. Then he asked how far behind schedule they would be if they took the entire midday halt. The question itself wasn't unreasonable. It was the fact that he was still thinking about time after everything else they'd discussed. That evening, June 29th, the guide sat down with Driscoll and walked him through the next day's forecast in detail. June 30th was expected to be the peak of the heat event. Furnace Creek was forecast to reach 129 degrees Fahrenheit. The next section of the route was a 6-mile crossing of completely open valley floor, the most exposed stretch of the entire trip. There was no natural shade, no practical bailout option once they were committed, and no meaningful landmarks at ground level to navigate by. The guide suggested they hold position for 24 hours and let the worst of the heat pass. He explained his reasoning clearly and didn't soften the risk. Driscoll refused. He said they were on schedule and intended to stay on schedule. He said he'd been through worse. The trouble with experience is that it gives us something to compare everything else against. Sometimes the comparison fits, sometimes it doesn't. The guy documented the conversation in his log. He wrote down the time. He noted that the client had been informed of the forecast and the associated risks in explicit terms and had declined to alter the plan. That night, the temperature hovered around 92 degrees. By then, Driscoll's body had spent 2 straight nights in heat that never dropped below 90. His fluid balance, electrolyte levels, and ability to regulate core temperature were all operating at a deficit before June 30th had even begun. He didn't know that. What he felt was tired, the kind of tired that follows a couple of hard days of physical work. It was a familiar feeling. He dealt with it before. He knew how to push through tired. At 4:22 a.m. on June 30th, the guide got up to begin the morning preparations and noticed that Driscoll's sleeping spot was empty. His pack was gone. Of the 4 1-liter water containers staged at the waypoint for the next leg, the guide's calculated minimum for a 6-mile crossing under the forecast conditions, 2 were missing. The other 2 were still sitting there. His satellite phone had been left on the ground next to his sleeping mat, powered off. His GPS watch, however, was still on his wrist. He had left on his own. He had left in the dark, carrying half the water the guide had planned for the crossing. He had no navigation equipment and no way to call for help, and he was heading east across 6 miles of open valley floor on what was expected to be the hottest day of the year. The guide radioed for assistance at 4:35 a.m. and immediately started moving east. Records later showed that Driscoll had left camp at 3:48 a.m. The air temperature in the Panamint Valley at that hour was approximately 91 degrees, already warm, already pulling moisture from the body with every breath. Under his boots, the valley floor was a mix of hard-packed gravel and stretches of pale salt crust, still releasing heat stored during 2 consecutive days of record temperatures. His pace held at roughly 3 miles per hour. It was steady and purposeful. The GPS track showed him moving straight east, closely aligned with the intended route. In the pre-dawn darkness, the Panamint Range appeared as a black silhouette on the horizon, a useful reference point, but not a precise bearing. Without a compass or a GPS unit of his own, Driscoll was navigating by instinct and the outline of the mountains, much the way he might have found his way around a dark job site back in Texas. Up to that point in his life, That approach had always worked.
Driscoll probably felt like he was making up time. In reality, he was trading water, energy, and body temperature for every mile.
At approximately 4:28 a.m., the GPS track began to drift, about 8 degrees south of the intended bearing. It was a gradual shift, the kind that would have been almost impossible to notice in the dark. On flat, featureless terrain, being 8 degrees off course doesn't feel like anything. The ground looks the same no matter which direction you're facing. The mountains are still roughly where you expect them to be. As far as you can tell, you're heading exactly where you're supposed to go. So he kept moving. By 5:15 a.m., he was 2.1 miles from camp and already 0.4 of a mile south of the intended route. The sun was starting to come up. The air temperature had climbed to 108 degrees. His pace was still close to 3 miles per hour. The GPS track shows no stops during this period. He kept moving steadily, with no hesitation and no indication that he thought anything was wrong. This was the point where something should have tipped him off, but apparently nothing did. The sun was rising in the east, directly ahead of him on the intended bearing. A man with 20 years of outdoor work behind him would normally use something like that as a rough check on direction. Yet the drift continued even as the light improved. Maybe the terrain gave him no reason to question where he was going. Maybe the effects of heat and dehydration were already beginning to narrow his focus. Most likely, it was some combination of the two.
Being lost and realizing you're lost are two very different things. Driscoll had already done the first without yet reaching the second.
Meanwhile, something else was happening inside his body, whether he noticed it or not. After 2.5 miles of exertion in 108-degree heat, carrying a pack on a body that had already spent 2 nights in near 90-degree temperatures without fully recovering, his fluid deficit was growing. Under those conditions, sweat loss can reach roughly 1 to 1.2 liters per hour. He had started with 2 liters. The numbers were already moving in the wrong direction. His pace dropped to around 1.8 miles per hour. The sun was fully up now, and the air temperature was climbing past 112 degrees. Underfoot, the valley floor had shifted from hard gravel to stretches of pale salt crust that reflected sunlight and pushed heat back upward with every step. Surface temperatures were approaching 150 degrees. By then, he was more than 0.8 of a mile south of the intended route and drifting farther away with each step. The mountain silhouettes that had helped orient him in the dark no longer offered much guidance. From the middle of the valley floor, they looked much the same from almost any position. There was nothing obvious to correct against. No road, no building, no tree, nothing. By this point, his 2 liters of water were almost certainly gone. He had been moving for roughly 90 minutes in steadily rising heat, carrying a body that was already starting from a fluid deficit built up over the previous 2 days. The sweating that had been keeping him cool was becoming less effective as his reserves dropped. His heart was working harder to move thickening blood through vessels that were beginning to narrow. His core temperature was rising. He was sweating heavily. His heart rate was elevated. His legs were beginning to feel the particular kind of heaviness that comes with heat exhaustion, not ordinary muscle fatigue, but something deeper, something that doesn't simply go away because you decide to push harder. He had felt versions of it before on job sites.
In West Texas, you find some shade, drink water, sit down for 20 minutes, and eventually it passes. Out here, there was no shade.
The water was gone, and the temperature was still climbing. His pace dropped below 1 mile per hour. The GPS data shows 2 full stops, each lasting somewhere between 4 and 6 minutes. That's consistent with someone sitting down to rest. By then, he was 1.2 miles south of the route. The air temperature had reached 118 degrees. Surface temperatures on the salt crust were above 160. He had no water left. It's worth pausing on what that number actually means. 160 degrees wasn't the air temperature, it was the surface he was sitting on during those stops. The salt crust beneath him was radiating heat upward into his body while the air pressed down from above. There was nowhere to move that wasn't hot.
Those stops are significant for another reason. One of the early neurological effects of heat stroke is impaired judgment, particularly the inability to accurately assess your own condition.
People in the early stages often believe they just need a few minutes of rest and will feel better afterward. They sit down expecting to get back up and continue. Sometimes they do. Sometimes the body has already crossed a threshold they can't recognize. Driscoll sat down. Then he got back up and continued walking in the same wrong direction. The GPS track shows a final stretch of less than 1/3 of a mile at a pace below 0.5 mile per hour. By this point, the track was no longer straight. It drifted slightly south, then corrected slightly north, then wandered south again. That kind of irregular movement is consistent with ataxia, the loss of coordinated muscle control that often accompanies severe heat stroke. The brain is no longer sending clean signals to the muscles. The body is still capable of moving, but it is no longer navigating with any real precision. It is simply continuing forward. At 7:02 a.m., the GPS watch recorded its final position. The last location was 1.4 miles south-southwest of the intended route, out on the open floor of Panamint Valley. The terrain was a mix of salt crust and gravel. There was no shade visible in any direction. An empty water container lay beside him. At that hour, the air temperature at Furnace Creek was already 118 degrees and still climbing toward the day's projected high of 129. Surface temperatures where he stopped were estimated to be above 160 degrees. The GPS data doesn't show a collapse or any sudden event. Instead, it shows a pace that had been steadily declining for nearly 2 hours, finally reaching zero and never increasing again. The guide's radio call at 4:35 a.m. had already set a search effort in motion, but the size of the terrain and the rapidly increasing heat created immediate challenges. By 8 a.m., conditions on the open valley floor were becoming dangerous even for search personnel. An aerial search was organized. A helicopter located Driscoll at 9:47 a.m., 5 hours and 9 minutes after he had left camp. He was found face down on the valley floor, 1.4 miles from the intended route. He was unresponsive. Ground crews reached him shortly afterward, and he was transported immediately. He was pronounced dead. His time of death was estimated to have occurred between 7 and 8 a.m., consistent with the data recorded by the GPS watch. Jivan Driscoll was 46 years old. He was found on the floor of Panamint Valley on the morning of June 30th, 2018, the same day Furnace Creek recorded 129 degrees Fahrenheit, the hottest June temperature ever reliably measured on Earth. He had been moving alone across exposed terrain for approximately 3 hours and 15 minutes. He had no shade, no communication device, no navigation equipment, and only half the water the crossing called for. He was found 1.4 miles from where he was supposed to be. The post-mortem examination determined the cause of death to be hyperthermia, exertional heat stroke complicated by acute dehydration. The autopsy findings themselves were largely unremarkable. There was mild cerebral edema and clear evidence of significant dehydration, but no pre-existing cardiac disease, vascular disease, or other underlying condition that contributed to his death. By all available evidence, he had been physically healthy. The death was ruled accidental. The official findings cited several contributing factors: separating from the guided group before the designated movement window, carrying an inadequate water supply for the forecast conditions, traveling without personal navigation equipment, leaving the satellite communication device behind and powered off, and sustained exertion on exposed terrain during a record heat event. The guide was cleared of any negligence. His permits, radio logs, and field notes documented the warnings he gave, the risks he explained, and the decisions Driscoll made on his own during the final 48 hours of the trip. The evidence that closed the case was remarkably consistent. The GPS watch provided position points at roughly 1-minute intervals, creating a record of his route from departure to the point where he stopped moving. The satellite phone's final sync, recorded the previous evening, confirmed his position at the waypoint. The guide's radio logs established the timeline of the search and response. 2 unused water containers remained at camp. 1 empty container was recovered at the scene. Partial boot prints preserved in softer sections of the salt crust matched the direction and distance of his deviation from the intended route. Every piece of evidence pointed toward the same conclusion. Driscoll hadn't died because he was weak, reckless, or unprepared. He died because, for the very first time in a very long time, the experience he trusted wasn't enough for the place he was in. It was July 12, 2013. The day began inside Golden Canyon Trail at Death Valley National Park, where extreme summer temperatures regularly transform an otherwise accessible trail into a dangerous environment for unprepared visitors. Alain Arcega was 23 years old and grew up in Fresno. Back in high school, he played wide receiver on the football team, and even after graduation, that athlete mentality never really went away.
Wide receiver. I keep picturing him running sprints in full pads, pushing through the last set when everyone else had already quit.
It just followed him into adulthood. He was living in Bakersfield, working part-time as a personal trainer, lifting weights almost every day, and running 5-kilometer races on weekends. He also had a small fitness page on Instagram where he'd post workout clips and progress updates from time to time. Staying active wasn't just a hobby for Alain anymore. It had become a huge part of who he was. And that's actually important. because it shaped the way he dealt with physical challenges. Alain was the kind of person who was used to pushing through discomfort. If something was hard, his first instinct usually wasn't to slow down or stop. It was to keep going and trust that his body could handle it. Over time, that mindset had become normal for him. But it also meant his threshold for turning around, asking for help, or admitting that something was becoming dangerous was a little higher than it might have been for other people, and that's not unusual at all. You see it a lot with athletes and people whose identities are built around being strong, capable, and physically dependable. The problem is that some environments don't reward that mindset. In places like a gym, a football field, or a weekend race, pushing through discomfort can actually work in your favor. But in a place like Death Valley, where the environment itself can overwhelm the human body, ignoring those early warning signs can become incredibly dangerous. Alain had no documented medical conditions, no history of heat illness, and toxicology later returned negative for all substances. He was, by every clinical measure, a healthy young man.
Part always stops me. Completely healthy. Nothing working against him on paper.
However, being physically fit can sometimes create false confidence in unfamiliar environments because adaptation to one type of physical stress does not automatically translate to another. He was accompanied by Troyjan Delgado, 25, a warehouse supervisor, and Neftar Yi, 24, a part-time community college student, both from Bakersfield. None of the three had meaningful experience in desert environments. Although they had grown up in California's Central Valley, where temperatures regularly exceed 100 degrees Fahrenheit in summer, the heat of the Central Valley and the heat of Death Valley are fundamentally different, a distinction that is often underestimated by first-time visitors. The Death Valley trip had been discussed casually for months as a bucket list idea. Its reputation as one of the hottest places on Earth was part of its appeal rather than a deterrent. For three men in their 20s who had never seriously considered what that reputation actually meant, the extremity itself made the destination attractive. Eventually, they settled on the weekend of July 12th without giving much thought to the timing. What they didn't realize was that they had chosen one of the hottest weekends of the year to visit Death Valley. July is brutal there. Temperatures regularly climb somewhere between 115 and 130 degrees Fahrenheit, and that's the time of year when park rangers deal with some of their highest numbers of heat-related emergencies. And that's actually something the park tries very hard to communicate. Death Valley's extreme temperatures aren't advertised as some exciting attraction, they're presented as a warning. The park wants visitors to understand exactly what kind of environment they're stepping into, but none of the three had really looked into any of that beforehand. Originally, the plan was actually pretty simple. Troyjan and Neftar had suggested keeping it easy. They would drive out to Badwater Basin, take a few pictures at the marker that identifies it as the lowest point in North America, spend a few minutes looking around, and then head back to the air-conditioned car.
I thought that was a good plan. A genuinely good plan.
That was it. It wasn't supposed to be a hiking trip at all. It was really just meant to be a short sightseeing stop before heading home. Alain changed that plan during the drive. After finding the Golden Canyon Trail on his phone, he proposed adding a hike and pushed for it with enough confidence that the simpler alternative began to feel overly cautious. He had no prior desert hiking experience, but he assumed his athletic background and overall fitness would make the environment less challenging for him. That assumption is common and often harmless in ordinary settings. In Death Valley in July, it can be fatal. Golden Canyon Trail is a relatively short 3-mile round-trip route near Furnace Creek that leads through narrow passageways and colorful sedimentary formations toward Red Cathedral, the usual turnaround point. It is a popular trail because it requires no technical skills, specialized equipment, or difficult climbing. But that's also part of what makes Golden Canyon dangerous. To first-time visitors, it doesn't look intimidating at all. It looks like an easy walk you could do in regular workout clothes and running shoes. The problem is that the environment is far more dangerous than it appears. Experienced desert hikers understand that. Most first-time visitors don't. And during July, the canyon actually makes the heat even worse. The rock walls absorb sunlight and radiate that heat back into the narrow passageways, while the ground itself can exceed 160 degrees Fahrenheit when air temperatures approach 130 degrees Fahrenheit. So hikers aren't just dealing with the temperature shown on a weather report. They're being hit by heat from above, below, and all around them at the same time.
And what feels deceptive to me is how harmless it looks from the outside, like an easy shaded walk, until you're already inside it and realize how quickly the conditions change.
Conditions on that day further removed many of the body's natural sources of relief. Relative humidity was extremely low, causing sweat to evaporate almost immediately and making it difficult to recognize how quickly fluid was being lost. Winds were minimal, providing virtually no cooling effect. Death Valley can be visited safely for short periods, but only with deliberate preparation. Extreme desert heat requires substantial hydration, appropriate clothing, prior heat acclimatization, and an understanding that general physical fitness is not the same as heat adaptation. This is exactly why the National Park Service tells visitors to avoid hiking after 10 o'clock in the morning during the summer. That recommendation isn't arbitrary. It's based on decades of incidents and reflects the point where the environment starts becoming dangerous for most people, no matter how physically fit they are. The warnings are posted all over the park and are difficult to miss. Meanwhile, their drive from Bakersfield wasn't going as planned. They got a late start, stopped in Mojave, spent some time at Badwater Basin, and by the time they arrived at the Golden Canyon trailhead, they were already past the recommended cutoff time for summer hiking. Temperatures had already climbed above 125 degrees Fahrenheit and were still rising. They also passed active heat advisory signs at the Furnace Creek Visitor Center along the way, but they didn't stop.
And given those warnings, if it were me, I wouldn't have treated that as something that I could just push through.
At the trailhead, additional warnings advised hikers about extreme heat, recommended water quantities, and instructed visitors to turn around if they experienced dizziness, headache, or weakness. Alain walked past the sign without reading it. Trojan glanced at it but said nothing.
Trojan saw it, read some of it, and then just kept walking.
Each man carried two 16.9-ounce water bottles, giving them about 33 ounces of water each for the entire hike. For a hike of that length in Death Valley's summer conditions, National Park Service guidance recommends roughly 2 to 3 liters or 67 to 100 ounces per person. They had brought less than half that amount and carried no electrolyte supplements, hydration packs, or emergency supplies. Alan wore a gray cotton t-shirt, athletic shorts, and running shoes. He brought no hat and declined sunscreen that Neftar offered, believing his darker complexion and the short duration of the hike would provide sufficient protection.
Neftar had sunscreen and offered it to him. Elaine said no, and I think that's a bad decision.
Both assumptions reflected ordinary experience rather than the realities of Death Valley in midsummer. The group also skipped the trail register, a system rangers use to narrow search efforts if hikers fail to return. They then entered Golden Canyon. The first part of the hike actually felt manageable. The unusual rock formations grabbed most of their attention, and Alain naturally drifted 30 to 40 feet ahead of the others, which was pretty normal for him during any kind of physical activity. But as they moved deeper into the canyon, things slowly started to change. Neftar had already gone through about half of his first water bottle, Trojan about a third, while Alain had only taken a few sips despite moving at a faster pace.
He was moving faster than both of them and drinking the least. That gap was already working against him, in my view.
The environment was changing too. As the canyon narrowed, the heat became much more intense. It wasn't just coming from the sun anymore. It was radiating from the canyon walls, the ground beneath them, and the open sky above, leaving almost no sense of relief anywhere around them. Alain still showed no signs of slowing down. Meanwhile, Trojan and Neftar gradually found themselves walking at a slower pace without really deciding to. Their attention shifted away from the scenery and towards simply managing their bodies in the heat. Alain continued ahead, still not acknowledging the conditions in the same way. Years of athletic training had conditioned him to dismiss discomfort as something to push through. In many environments, that mindset is useful. In extreme heat, however, discomfort is not an obstacle to overcome, but an early warning system. Eventually, Neftar decided he was turning back. He had already noticed he was going through his water much faster than he expected, and he realized he wasn't going to have enough left to safely finish the hike.
He made that call himself, without anyone prompting him.
Trojan had been thinking the same thing and reached that conclusion on his own. Meanwhile, Alain was already farther ahead on the trail. When they told him they were heading back, he didn't seem too concerned. He basically said the turnaround point was close, and that there wasn't much reason to worry. Then he just kept walking. There wasn't any big discussion after that. Nobody made plans about where they'd meet later or talked about what to do if someone didn't come back on time.
No meeting point, no backup plan, just a quick exchange, and I think he was around the bend after that.
After a brief exchange, Trojan and Neftar turned around and started heading back toward the trailhead, while Alain continued deeper into the canyon by himself. Before separating, Alain told his friends the trail was mostly flat, the turnaround point was close, and he expected to be back at the trailhead within 30 to 40 minutes. On paper, the estimate was reasonable. Under ordinary conditions, the remaining distance would have taken well under an hour. What his calculation failed to account for was how much the environment had already begun wearing him down. Alain had consistently consumed less water than either Neftar or Trojan, despite moving at a faster pace. By the time he separated from them, he had only finished about half of his first bottle and had roughly 25 ounces remaining for the rest of the hike. He continued at the same brisk pace for a while, still assuming the hike remained manageable despite the worsening conditions. The canyon around him had become noticeably quieter without the presence of the other two. There was no longer anyone nearby to compare pace with, no one asking how he was feeling, and no outside perspective that might have challenged his decision to continue.
And what stands out to me is how that kind of confidence can still feel reasonable in the moment, even when the conditions around you are already starting to change in ways you don't fully realize yet.
Alain eventually reached the Red Cathedral turnaround point where he briefly stopped, finished his first water bottle, and began heading back toward the trailhead. By then, his body was already under significant thermal stress. His return pace gradually slowed. The confident stride he had maintained earlier was beginning to disappear, replaced by shorter, more deliberate steps. The effort required to keep walking was steadily increasing. Eventually, Alain emptied his second and final water bottle while still nearly a mile from the trailhead.
A mile left and completely out of water. That, in my view, is the moment the hike stopped being manageable.
He was now completely without water in temperatures nearing 130 degrees Fahrenheit, surrounded by canyon walls and sun-baked ground that continued radiating heat from every direction. From that point onward, there was very little room for mistakes. He still had a considerable distance left to cover, but no remaining way to replace the fluids his body had already lost. His gray cotton t-shirt, which had been soaked with sweat earlier in the hike, now clung heavily to his body as he kept walking. The clothes that had seemed perfectly fine at the trailhead were no longer doing him any favors. By that point, he'd also spent well over an hour under direct midday sun without sunscreen. His face, neck, and forearms had been exposed to uninterrupted sunlight ever since they entered the canyon. As he continued toward the trailhead, the signs that something was changing became increasingly difficult to ignore. His pace continued to slow, and the confidence that had defined the first half of the hike was gradually being replaced by a body that was becoming harder and harder to manage. By that point, he was already much deeper into danger than he appeared to be. Around this stage of the return hike, an experienced hiking couple from Nevada, who had started their own hike much earlier in the morning, passed Alain while heading back toward the trailhead. Both later provided consistent statements to park rangers. They described him as deeply flushed, unsteady on his feet, and unusually unresponsive. When they greeted him, he neither looked toward them nor acknowledged their presence.
He didn't even glance over when they spoke to him, just kept walking, staring straight ahead.
They kept walking because, at the time, nothing they saw immediately made it seem like he was in a life-threatening situation. He was still on his feet, still moving, and not very far from the trailhead. Under normal circumstances, that would have been a reasonable assumption to make. What they didn't realize was that his condition was already deteriorating. By that point, he was already showing signs consistent with severe heat illness, even though he was still able to walk on his own. Physical evidence later showed that Alain's coordination continued to deteriorate as he made his way back toward the trailhead. Investigators documented footprints that gradually deviated 8 to 10 feet away from the marked path toward the East Canyon wall. Whether he intentionally moved there seeking relief or had already lost meaningful spatial awareness could not be determined. Both explanations are consistent with severe neurological impairment caused by extreme heat. By this stage, his body was rapidly running out of options. His limited water supply had already been exhausted, and the environmental conditions no longer allowed his thermoregulatory systems to keep up with the heat surrounding him. The air temperature exceeded normal skin temperature, the ground beneath him radiated extreme heat, and his body could no longer effectively dissipate the heat it was generating itself. By this stage, there were signs that his body was losing its ability to regulate its temperature. His cotton shirt, which had likely been soaked earlier in the hike, was only partially damp when he was found, suggesting that his sweating had already begun to diminish while he was still trying to make his way back toward the trailhead.
A shirt that should be completely soaked through, barely damp. I have to sit with that image every time.
Once that happened, the situation escalated rapidly. Severe dehydration reduced his blood volume, forcing his heart to work harder to maintain circulation while his body simultaneously struggled to cool itself. As his core temperature continued rising, his coordination, judgment, and spatial awareness would have progressively deteriorated alongside it. By this point, the environment was no longer something he was navigating successfully, but something his body was increasingly unable to overcome. Eventually, Alain made his way over to the East Canyon wall, but it didn't offer any relief at all. It was still sitting in direct sunlight and radiating heat back into the canyon instead of protecting him from it.
He went to that wall looking for something, shade, anything, and I think the wall had nothing to give him.
Whether he intentionally sat down there or simply collapsed is something no one can say for certain anymore. At that point, though, it didn't make much of a difference. Without water, without shade, and without anyone nearby to realize what was happening, he was no longer capable of getting himself back to safety. Meanwhile, Trojan and Neftar were sitting in the parked car with the air conditioning running. The 30 to 40 minutes Alen had estimated had already come and gone, but there wasn't a specific moment when either of them suddenly panicked. The concern just slowly built over time. At first, they assumed there was a simple explanation. Maybe Elaine had gone a little farther than he planned. Maybe he had stopped to take pictures near Red Cathedral. Maybe he was just walking more slowly on the way back.
I've sat in that kind of waiting, and I know exactly how those explanations feel. Completely reasonable, right up until they aren't.
None of those explanations sounded unreasonable at the time. But as the wait stretched on, those explanations became increasingly difficult to reconcile with the amount of time that had passed. Neftar eventually stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the trail entrance to look into the canyon, but the first bend limited visibility to only a few hundred feet. The two men briefly talked about what to do before deciding to go back into the canyon themselves. They didn't have much left to work with anymore. Between them, they only had part of a water bottle remaining after their own hike back and the time they had spent waiting in the parking area.
They were already worn down from their own hike out. Going back in was putting themselves at risk too.
Still, they couldn't just sit there any longer, so they re-entered the canyon. By then, conditions were likely even harsher than before. The sun had been beating down for hours, and the canyon walls and exposed ground had continued absorbing that heat and radiating it back into the narrow passageways. As they retraced their route, they kept expecting to eventually see Elaine walking toward them. Instead, they spotted him sitting against the East Canyon wall about half a mile from the trailhead and several feet off the marked path. Immediately, they knew something was seriously wrong. He wasn't responding. His skin was dry and deeply flushed, and he was no longer sweating at all. His breathing was slow and irregular, with long pauses in between that made it difficult to tell when the next breath would come.
Those pauses between breaths? I can't imagine standing over someone and waiting for the next one to come.
Trojan immediately called emergency services. Cell service inside the canyon was weak and unreliable, but the call stayed connected long enough for him to explain where they were and describe Elaine's condition. The information was quickly relayed to National Park Service personnel at Furnace Creek, who immediately began coordinating an emergency response. Nearby, the experienced Nevada couple who had encountered Elaine earlier in the day were speaking with a ranger at the parking area. As dispatch information circulated, they immediately realized the description matched the same hiker they had passed on the trail while he was still walking under his own power.
They passed him. They said hello, and now they're standing in a parking lot understanding what that moment actually was.
National Park Service personnel quickly initiated a rescue response. A helicopter was dispatched while ground rangers entered the canyon on foot. By the time rescuers reached Elaine, he was unresponsive and had no detectable pulse. CPR was initiated at the scene before he was prepared for air transport and flown to Desert Valley Hospital in Victorville, California. Despite those efforts, he was later pronounced dead. His core temperature upon hospital arrival was 109.4 degrees Fahrenheit. The entire sequence, from separating from his friends to being found unresponsive inside the canyon, had unfolded in a little over an hour. National Park Service rangers later documented the scene, including Elaine's position against the East Canyon wall, the footprints leading away from the trail, the location of both empty water bottles, the condition of his clothing, and the extensive UV damage visible on exposed skin. Trojan Delgado and Neftar Yi were interviewed separately by investigators, and their accounts were consistent with each other and with the physical evidence. Neither man was charged with any wrongdoing. Investigators concluded they had made appropriate decisions by turning back when they recognized the danger and by returning into the canyon once Elaine failed to come back as expected. The incident was officially classified as an accidental death caused by environmental heat exposure. The Inyo County coroner later determined the cause of death to be hyperthermia, secondary to exertional heat stroke, with dehydration and prolonged sun exposure listed as contributing factors. The autopsy documented widespread heat-related cellular damage, early signs of kidney and liver injury, and severe UV damage across his face, neck, and forearms. No underlying medical conditions were identified, and toxicology results were negative. The amount of water he carried was also found to be dramatically insufficient for the conditions. A hike of that length in Death Valley's extreme summer heat would have required roughly 2 to 3 liters per person, while Alain had started with only 33 ounces. His death was ultimately recorded as one of Death Valley's recurring heat-related fatalities, incidents that continue to occur despite extensive warnings posted throughout the park. 21st of June, 2017, a little after 10 in the morning. And deep in the Grand Canyon, the air was already building toward the kind of afternoon that kills, with the heat down at the river climbing past 110 degrees, when a middle-aged couple stopped at a shaded oasis called Indian Garden and began arguing with the one man they had hired to keep them alive, about to send him back up the trail without them. They were a married couple in their early 50s, Del Bramble and his wife Corinne, and they were, by every ordinary measure, exactly the kind of people you would expect to be fine. They were fit for their age, careful, and almost obsessively prepared. They came from a cool green part of the country where the summers are mild and the hills are gentle and shaded, and they had spent years hiking the trails near home every weekend, building up what they believed was real experience and real toughness. They were planners, the kind of couple who turned every trip into a project, who made spreadsheets and packing lists and studied the reviews of everything they bought. They read everything, watched every video, bought the right boots and the right packs and the right little bottles of electrolyte tablets. And they took a quiet pride in never being the unprepared tourist they saw getting into trouble on the news. In their whole lives together, being careful and being determined had never once failed them. It was who they were, and it was the reason they had a good life, and it had taught them a lesson that would prove fatal in the one place it did not apply, which was that if you just prepared hard enough and refused to quit, you could do anything you set your mind to. The Grand Canyon had been on their list for a long time, the trip they promised themselves, and the one thing they wanted more than anything was to stand at the very bottom, at the edge of the Colorado River, and say they had done it. They had trained for a year, they had earned this, they felt, and they were not the type to do it halfway. For months before the trip, they had let everyone around them know it was coming. There was a countdown on their social pages, and there were photographs of the training hikes. The two of them grinning on their local hills, with captions about how the Grand Canyon was next, about how they were finally doing the big one. They told friends and family the same thing over and over, that they were going all the way to the river, all the way to the bottom, that they had not spent a year training just to stop halfway down and turn around like the day tourists who only came for a photo at the top. Reaching the Colorado River had quietly become the whole point of the thing, the promise they had made out loud to everyone they knew, the story they were already half telling before they had lived it. They studied maps of the trail until they could recite the mileage and the landmarks by heart, and they came to believe, the way careful and capable people sometimes do, that knowing about a thing was the same as being ready for it, that having read about the heat was the same as having survived it. They pictured the triumph at the bottom 100 times. What none of their reading and none of their planning ever quite made real to them was the single plain fact that mattered more than all the rest of it combined, which was that everything they walked down, every easy step, they would have to climb back up in the worst heat of the day, on legs and hearts and minds that would have nothing left to give. I want to say up front that these two were not reckless. They planned every detail and trained for a year. And that's what makes it so hard, because preparation gave them a confidence the canyon doesn't honor. To understand what went wrong, you have to understand that the Grand Canyon works backwards from every hike these two had ever done. On almost any other trail, you climb up first, when your legs are fresh and the morning is cool, and then you come down when you are tired, which is the easy direction, so the reward and the rest come at the end. The canyon flips all of that on its head. You start at the top, on the rim, in the cool, clean air, and you walk down, feeling wonderful, feeling strong, losing thousands of feet of elevation without hardly trying, grinning the whole way, and every one of those easy downhill steps is a step you are borrowing, a step you will have to repay later by climbing back up the same enormous wall of rock on legs that will no longer be fresh. The trouble is that the bottom of the canyon is not cool. It is a deep, narrow gorge of dark, ancient stone that soaks up the sun all day and holds it like the inside of an oven, routinely 20 to 30 degrees hotter than the rim far above, so that a pleasant morning of 80 degrees up top becomes 110 or 115 degrees down at the river, with the trail surface underfoot hotter still. The rangers there have a saying they repeat to anyone who will listen, that going down is optional, but coming up is mandatory, and it is the truest thing anyone can tell you about that place. It means the descent is a choice you make freely, feeling great, and the ascent is a debt that will be collected no matter what, whether you have the strength left to pay it or not. A good guide exists to protect you from the one mistake the canyon is designed to trick you into, which is going too far down, too late in the morning, chasing a reward at the bottom that you will simply not have the body or the cool hours to climb back from. Here's the thing almost nobody understands before they go.
It's the only hike I know where the easy part comes first and the part that kills you comes last, when your tank is already empty.
The thing that kills people down there is heat, and heat kills in a way that is far more insidious than most people realize. Your body is a machine that runs at one steady temperature, and it works hard all the time to hold that temperature no matter what the world around it is doing. In extreme heat, when you are exerting yourself, climbing, sweating, that machine can start to take on warmth faster than it can shed it. Sweat stops being enough, especially in a place where there is no shade and no cool air to be found anywhere. The core temperature begins to climb, and once it pushes past a certain threshold, the body's whole cooling system begins to fail all at once, and you slide from heat exhaustion into heat stroke, which is a true medical emergency that can kill a healthy adult in a shockingly short time. And here's the cruel part, the part that makes it so deadly on a trail with no easy way out. As the brain itself overheats, the first things to go are judgment and coordination. People in the grip of heat stroke grow confused. They stop making sense. They sometimes feel a strange calm or even a burst of misplaced euphoria. They make terrible decisions. They wander off the trail. They stop drinking. They sit down in the sun. They insist to anyone nearby that they are fine and just need a minute. Water helps, but water alone cannot stop heat stroke once it takes hold. And drinking too much water while sweating out all your salt brings on its own separate and dangerous crisis. By the time a person is in real danger down there, the part of their mind that should be screaming at them to stop, to cool down, to get help, is very often the exact part that has already quietly stopped working. This is why the rangers are so insistent that you plan your day around the clock and the thermometer instead of around how you feel, because how you feel is the one instrument you cannot trust once the heat has you. A strong, fit, determined person feeling good at the bottom of that canyon at noon is not a safe person. They are very often a person whose body has already started to fail and whose brain has not yet been told.
Think with me about how cruel that is. The heat cooks the exact part of your brain that would tell you to stop, so by the time you're in real danger, the judge in your head has already left.
Emmett was the guide they had hired, a man who had grown up in that country and had walked the trails of the canyon more times than he could possibly count, who had pulled more overconfident hikers back from the edge of real disaster than he cared to remember. He was not a reckless man, and his plan for the brambles was a careful one, built on everything the canyon had taught him. They would start down in the cool dark before dawn, headlamps on, when the air was still kind and the rock had given up its heat overnight, and they would descend only as far as a green-shaded oasis partway down the trail called Indian Garden, and then they would turn and be climbing steadily back toward the rim well before the heat of the day came down on the inner canyon like a hammer. The river was not on his plan, and he had told them that plainly more than once, and he had told them exactly why, because reaching the river in the last week of June and then trying to climb nearly 4,500 feet back out of the gorge in the afternoon is the precise thing that fills the canyon's long list of the dead. For the first few hours, everything went beautifully, exactly the way it always does right before it goes wrong. They went down through the cool gray morning, feeling strong and happy, and more than a little vindicated. The enormous walls opening up around them in the growing light, the miles falling away under their boots. And that feeling, that easy, effortless downhill strength in the cool of the morning, was the very trap the canyon lays for everyone who comes. Because the better they felt going down, the more certain they became that Emmett was being an old woman about the whole thing, that his cautious little turnaround was meant for weaker and softer people than the two of them, and that the river, their river, the entire reason they had come, was sitting right there for the taking. Somewhere on the way down, in the last stretch where a signal still reached the bottom of the canyon, Corinne sent a text to a friend back home, one her friend would later share, and it survives now in the way these last messages always seem to, made unbearable by everything that came after it. She wrote that they were deep in the canyon and feeling amazing, that the views were beyond anything the photographs had ever promised, that they were close now, so close to the river they had crossed the entire country to touch. She made a small joke about the guide wanting to turn them around early, something light and dismissive about how he clearly did not know who he was dealing with, how the two of them had not trained for a solid year just to quit a couple of miles short of the whole point. She said the morning had been the easiest hiking of her life, which to anyone who knows that canyon is the most frightening line in the whole message, because the ease of the way down is precisely the lie the place tells you. She said she would send a picture from the bottom, from the water's edge, the very moment they reached it. She told her friend she loved her and that this was the best day of her life. It was the last thing anyone back home ever heard from her.
Someone named Nova Storm summed it up perfectly on my last video, that if life has never smacked you in the face, one day it certainly will. That was Del and Corin, two people who were sure they'd never lose a battle.
It came to a head at Indian Garden, late in the morning, with the heat already building fast and the two of them still riding high on that downhill confidence. This was the turnaround, Emmett told them. This was the spot, this was the time, and every single minute they spent going lower was a minute they would pay for twice over on the way back up, in heat that was about to turn deadly. The river was still about a few miles further down, and well over 1,000 feet of steep descent below them, and the plain arithmetic of it was simple and merciless, that if they went to the water now, they would be climbing back out in the killing heat of the afternoon with nothing left in the tank. He was not asking, and he was not negotiating. It was the most important call a canyon guide ever makes, the entire reason a sane person hires one in the first place, and he made it as clearly and as firmly as he knew how, looking them in the eye and telling them the truth, and they refused him. To two people who had trained for a year and promised the whole world they would reach the river, a guide telling them to stop a couple of miles short did not land as wisdom, and it did not land as safety. It landed as insult. It sounded like a lack of faith in them, like timidity, like a cautious man covering himself while their dreams sat right there in plain view, close enough to taste. They had spent their whole lives being told that quitting was the only real failure, that the people who succeeded were the ones who pushed through when others turned back. So they told Emmett that they would go on to the river without him, that they had not come all this way and trained all that time to be turned around a stone's throw from the finish. And in so many words, standing there in the rising heat, they let him go.
What gets me most is the timing of it. They fired the one man reading the clock and the thermometer for them at the exact moment those two things were about to matter more than anything else on Earth.
People always ask why he did not simply stop them, or refuse, or physically drag them back up the trail to safety, and the answer is one of the hardest parts of this whole story. A guide cannot force two grown adults to turn around, and the moment they dismissed him, in plain words, in front of other hikers, he had no authority over them at all. The trail itself is public, and day hiking it requires no permit of any kind, so there was no ranger at a gate, no rule, nothing on Earth that could legally stop two determined adults from walking as far down as they wanted to go. He could not follow them down to the river either, not safely, because doing so would have put him in the exact same deadly trap he was trying to pull them out of, descending lower and later into the building heat with a climb out that only got worse and more lethal by the hour. He argued with them hard, far harder than his job or his contract required him to. He told them plainly, without softening any of it, that people died doing exactly this, that the heat at the bottom would not care in the slightest how fit or how prepared or how determined they were, that the climb back out would break bodies far stronger than theirs. He gave them what extra water he could safely spare, and he told them the truth to their faces one last time, that if they went down now, in this, they might very well not come back up. They thanked him, more or less, and went anyway. And then, because there was truly nothing else that he was allowed or able to do, he went straight to the small ranger station there at Indian Garden, where a summer ranger and an emergency phone sit, waiting for exactly this kind of moment. And he raised the alarm the instant the two of them were out of sight, heading down toward the river into the worst heat of the day.
Imagine being Emmett on that climb out. I can't think of anything worse, seeing the whole thing coming, having said it to their faces, and being ordered away with nothing left that you're allowed to do.
They did reach the river. That is the part that makes this so hard to tell. Sometime in the heavy, pressing heat of the early afternoon, the two of them came down the last steep switchbacks of a brutal section that the old-timers call the Devil's Corkscrew, and out onto the sand at the edge of the Colorado, and they got the exact thing they had crossed the entire country for: the cold green water, the photograph, the promise kept in full. You can imagine the triumph of that moment, the pure vindication of it, the two of them standing at the bottom of the world, having done it their own way, having looked a lifelong expert in the eye and pushed past him and been proven right, or so it must have felt. But the river was never the achievement, and it was never even really the halfway point, because the true halfway point on that trail is not measured in miles walked, it is measured in what your body has left to give, and by the time they turned around to start back up, they had already quietly spent almost all of it. They were now nearly 4,500 feet below the rim, in temperatures well past 110 degrees, with the sun directly overhead and the dark rock radiating heat from every side, facing a climb that would have been serious for a fresh hiker in the cool of dawn. Every easy downhill step from that beautiful, cool morning had just come due, all at once with brutal interest, and there was no guide beside them now, no shade to hide in, and not one single cool hour left anywhere in the day to spend.
Now, I've stood at the bottom of some brutal climbs myself, but every step those two took down into that canyon was one that they would have to repay later, uphill, in the hottest part of the day.
There is a last image of them that stays with the people who pieced this together afterward, drawn from the photographs later recovered from the phone found with them, and from the accounts of the hikers who passed them going the other way. There they are at the river's edge, at the very bottom of the whole world, sunburned and beaming and utterly, completely happy, holding up the moment they had promised everyone, the cold green water at their backs, the great walls rising up and up and up on every side of them. In that photograph, they do not look like people in danger. They look like people at the top of a dream, people who had been told no and had done it anyway and been proven right, people in the single best moment of a life spent chasing exactly this kind of moment. That is the thing that makes it so hard to look at now. What the photograph does not show, what neither of them could feel yet through the joy and the adrenaline and the deep, pleasant exhaustion, was that the air around them was already lethal, that their bodies had already begun the slow, quiet failure that killing heat brings on, and that the wall of rock behind them, the one they now had to turn and climb thousands of feet of it in the full afternoon sun, had already quietly decided how the rest of their day was going to go. It is the last clear picture of them alive, two people smiling at the bottom of a beautiful trap they had fought so hard to spring on themselves. Dell and Corinne Bramble never made it back up to the rim. On the long, brutal climb out of the inner gorge, in the very worst of the afternoon heat, their bodies did exactly what Emmett had promised them they would do, and exactly what the canyon does to so many people every single summer. Somewhere on the steep exposed switchbacks above the river, with the dark rock throwing the heat back at them from every side and not a scrap of shade to be found, the heat overtook them, first one of them and then the other. Their core temperatures climbed past the point of no return, and their minds slid into the confusion and the terrible false calm that heat stroke brings, the same cruel process that has taken so many before them. They would have grown confused. They would have stopped making sense to each other. They would have stopped being able to climb, and then stopped being able to stand, and somewhere in there, the part of them that understood they were dying would have quietly switched off. Emmett had reached a ranger and raised the alarm as fast as any human being could have, and a rescue was launched the moment the words were out of his mouth. But the inner canyon in that kind of heat is one of the hardest places on the entire continent to reach a dying person in time, and help that has to descend into a furnace in order to climb back out of it moves slowly and at terrible risk to the rescuers themselves. By the time anyone could reach them, high on the wall above the river they had fought so hard to touch, there was nothing left to be done for either of them. They had gotten their river. It had cost them everything they had, and then their lives. The recovery, like everything else in that canyon, was slow and dangerous and heartbreaking, carried out in heat that threatened the very rangers sent down to bring them home. And Emmett, the guide who had grown up in that country and had done every single thing right, carried something up out of that canyon that no person should ever have to carry. He had read the day exactly correctly, down to the hour. He had said the words out loud, plainly, to their faces, more than once. He had been fired for it, and had raised the alarm at the ranger station the instant they were out of sight, and it had still not been enough to save them, because the decision that killed them had already been made and sealed the moment they walked past him at Indian Garden toward the river. Everyone who understood that canyon knew, with total and complete certainty, that it was not his fault, that he had done more than his job asked of him, and more than most guides would have dared. But knowing a thing like that and living with it are two entirely different weights, and Emmett would carry the memory of that morning, and of the look on their faces when they told him to go, for a very long time, maybe for the rest of his life. He had spent his whole life learning to read that place, and the one time it mattered most, the people he was reading it for would not listen.
This is the line the rangers there repeat like a prayer. Down is optional, but up is mandatory. Dell and Corinne proved it in the cruelest way I know of.
In the end, the thing that killed Dell and Corinne was not the heat exactly, and it was not bad luck, and it was not a lack of preparation, because heaven knows they had prepared for a solid year. It was the reward itself. It was the river. The very goal they had crossed the country for. The dream they had promised everyone they loved. The thing they fired their own guide in order to reach was the exact trap the whole trip had been built around. And the turnaround they refused at Indian Garden was the single thing that would have saved both of their lives. Down is optional, the rangers say, and up is mandatory, and the Brambles proved that grim little sentence as completely as anyone ever has. They had spent a year learning everything there was to learn about that canyon, except the one lesson that actually mattered in the end, which is that the canyon does not care how ready you feel, or how far you have already come, or how much the dream is worth to you, or what you promised the people back home. It does not grade on effort or on desire. It asks one question and one question only, which is whether you turned around in time. And a few miles from the bottom, on the best morning of their entire lives, feeling stronger than they ever had, they looked at the one man whose whole job was to answer that question for them, and they decided that they knew better.
The part I can't stop thinking about is that they actually succeeded. They reached the river they dreamed about, they got their photograph, and that victory was the exact thing that killed them both on the way back up.
I do not tell this story to mock them, because there is nothing funny in it, and because what drove them was something most of us would recognize in ourselves. They were not fools, and they were not arrogant in the way we usually mean it. They were careful people who wanted, badly, to finish the thing they had started, who had promised themselves and everyone they loved that they would reach the bottom, and who could not bear to turn around a few miles short of a dream they had carried for years. That impulse to push through, to not quit, to finish what you set out to do, is the very thing we praise in people almost everywhere else in life. But a place like the bottom of the Grand Canyon in June does not reward that impulse. It punishes it without mercy and without exception. The hardest and most important skill in the wild is not endurance or courage or preparation. It is the humility to turn around, on time, short of the goal, when the person who knows more than you tells you it is time to go home. It is the willingness to let the canyon win the argument. Del and Corinne could not do it. Almost no one who dies that way ever could. And their guide was already high on the trail above them, climbing out into the safe, cool evening, listening for a helicopter that would arrive far too late to matter.